Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The call came in at 2:47 a.m. on a humid Tuesday morning in August 1994. Sheriff Elijah Crankshaw had been the law in Millhaven, Arkansas for 23 years, and at 61 years old, he thought he'd seen everything a small town of 4,000 souls could offer. The voice on the other end of his bedside phone belonged to Deputy Ichabod Wigglesworth, and there was something in the younger man's tone that made Crankshaw sit up immediately. His wife Constance stirring beside him in the darkness. "Sheriff, we got a situation down at Grimwald's funeral home," Wigglesworth said, his voice tight with an emotion Crankshaw couldn't quite place. "You're going to want to see this yourself." "What kind of situation?" Crankshaw asked, already reaching for his uniform hanging on the back of the bedroom door. I don't rightly know how to explain it, Sheriff. Mrs. Mehitable Thornberry called it in. She was walking past the funeral home, said she does that sometimes when she can't sleep, on account of her husband being buried in the cemetery out back. And she saw lights on in the basement. Lights that were moving around. Probably just Silas working late, Crankshaw said, though something about the situation already felt off. Silas Grimwald had been the town's mortician for nearly 40 years, taking over the business from his father before him. The man was peculiar, certainly, but harmless enough. "That's what I thought too, Sheriff. But when I went to check it out..." Wigglesworth paused, and Crankshaw could hear him swallow hard over the line. "The front door was wide open, and there's a smell coming from inside. Not the usual formaldehyde smell, neither. Something else. Something wrong." Crankshaw told Wigglesworth to wait for him outside the building, and not to let anyone else near the premises. He dressed quickly, kissed Constance on the forehead when she asked if everything was all right. "Just checking on something, dear, go back to sleep," and drove through the empty streets of Millhaven toward the funeral home that sat like a Gothic monument on the corner of Elm and Meridian. The Grimwald Funeral Home had served Millhaven since 1892, a Victorian mansion converted to its current purpose by Silas's grandfather. 3 stories of weathered gray wood and elaborate gingerbread trim, it looked exactly like what it was. A house where the dead were prepared for their final rest. Crankshaw had been inside countless times over the years, attending funerals, investigating the occasional break-in attempt, or just stopping by to chat with Silas about town matters. But he'd never seen it like this. Every window in the building blazed with light, as if someone had turned on every lamp and overhead fixture in the place. The front door stood open just as Wigglesworth had described, and even from his patrol car, Crankshaw could detect an odd sweetness in the air, like flowers left too long in a vase mixed with something chemical and sharp. Deputy Wigglesworth stood by his own vehicle, his young face pale in the streetlight. At 28, he'd only been with the department for 3 years, and Crankshaw could see this was rattling him. "Mrs. Thornberry?" Crankshaw asked. "Sent her home, Sheriff." She was pretty shaken up, said she saw shadows moving in ways that didn't look natural. Wigglesworth gestured toward the funeral home. "I went in, just to the entrance hall. That smell gets stronger the further in you go. And, Sheriff, I heard something from the basement. Like voices, but not quite." Crankshaw studied the building, his instincts honed by decades of police work all firing at once. Something was very wrong here. He reached into his patrol car and grabbed his flashlight, even though the building was lit up like a Christmas tree. Stay behind me, he told Wigglesworth, and keep your hand on your weapon, but don't draw unless I do. They entered through the front door, their footsteps echoing on the polished hardwood floor of the entrance hall. The smell hit Crankshaw immediately, that sick sweet odor underlaid with something that made his stomach turn. The reception area looked normal enough, burgundy wallpaper with a subtle floral pattern, heavy wooden furniture, a guest book open on a stand. But the door leading to the preparation room stood ajar, and from somewhere below came a sound that made both men freeze. It was humming, a tuneless, wandering humming that seemed to come from multiple throats at once. "Silas?" Crankshaw called out, his voice carrying through the building. "Silas Grimwald, this is Sheriff Crankshaw. You in here?" The humming stopped abruptly, as if cut off by a switch. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. Crankshaw moved forward, pushing through the door into the preparation area. This was where bodies were embalmed, dressed, and placed in caskets for viewing. He'd been back here before, always finding it meticulously clean and organized despite the grim nature of the work performed within. Tonight was different. 3 gurneys stood in the main preparation room, each holding a form covered by a white sheet. That wasn't unusual in itself. Grimwald often had multiple bodies to prepare, especially during the winter months when the elderly were more vulnerable. But the sheets were moving, subtle rises and falls that had nothing to do with any breeze from the open door. "Jesus Christ," Wigglesworth whispered behind him. Crankshaw approached the nearest gurney slowly, reaching out with one hand while the other rested on his service weapon. He grasped the edge of the sheet and pulled it back. The body beneath was that of Cornelius Moldcrum, who had died of a heart attack 5 days ago. Crankshaw had attended the viewing just yesterday afternoon, but Cornelius's chest was rising and falling in a mechanical rhythm, and his eyes, which should have been sewn shut, were open and staring at the ceiling. His lips moved slightly and that humming sound emerged, though his expression remained fixed in death's peace. Crankshaw jerked the sheet off the second gurney. Prudence Witherspoon, dead of cancer a week ago, buried 3 days past. Her family had held a beautiful service, yet here she lay, her chest moving with the same mechanical breathing, her mouth forming that horrible humming. The third gurney held Ezekiel Brandywine, the town's former postmaster, who had supposedly been cremated 2 days ago after dying in his sleep. "They're dead," Wigglesworth said, his voice cracking. "Sheriff, I was at Moldcrum's viewing. I saw him in his casket. These people are dead." A sound from below made them both turn. Footsteps on the basement stairs, slow and measured. Crankshaw drew his weapon, motioning for Wigglesworth to do the same. The door to the basement stood at the far end of the preparation room, and it was from there that Silas Grimwald emerged. The mortician looked terrible. His usually neat gray hair stood up in wild tufts. His clothes were rumpled and stained with substances Crankshaw didn't want to identify, and his eyes had a fevered brightness that spoke of many sleepless nights. In his hands, he carried what looked like an old medical journal, its pages yellowed with age. "Sheriff," Grimwald said, his voice hoarse, "you shouldn't be here. Not tonight. I'm so close to understanding it all." "Silas," Crankshaw said, keeping his weapon pointed at the ground but ready. "What have you done?" "Done?" Grimwald laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "I've discovered something miraculous, Sheriff. Something that changes everything we know about death." He gestured to the bodies on the gurneys with the journal. "They're not alive, not exactly. But they're not gone either. They're suspended, waiting." "Waiting for what?" Crankshaw asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "For the proper conditions." for the right combination of chemicals and electrical stimulation. My grandfather knew, Sheriff. He left notes hidden in the walls of this place. He'd discovered something during the Civil War, when he worked as a field surgeon. Something about the boundary between life and death being more fluid than we believed. Grimwald moved closer, and Crankshaw raised his weapon slightly. The mortician didn't seem to notice. I've been perfecting his formula for years. Testing it. The families think their loved ones are buried or cremated, but I keep them here first. I preserve them in ways you couldn't imagine. And sometimes, Sheriff, sometimes they respond. Silas, these people are dead. Their families have grieved them. You can't what? Grimwald's eyes flashed with anger. Can't push the boundaries of science? Can't explore what happens in those moments between final breath and final darkness? Look at them, Sheriff. They're humming. They're breathing. There's something still there, something we can reach. From the basement came more sounds, shuffling footsteps, multiple sets of them, and that horrible humming growing stronger. Grimwald smiled, a terrible expression on his haggard face. The others want to come up, he said. The ones from the past months. I've been keeping them in the cold storage below, waiting for the right moment to continue my work. Some of them are quite responsive now. How many, Silas? Crankshaw asked, his blood running cold. How many bodies do you have down there? Bodies? Grimwald tilted his head. That's such a limited word, Sheriff. They're subjects, participants in the greatest experiment ever conducted. There are 14 currently in various stages of preparation. 14? Wigglesworth's voice was barely a whisper. Sheriff, that's everyone who's died in Millhaven in the past 2 months. The footsteps on the stairs grew louder, and Crankshaw made a decision. He grabbed Grimwald by the arm, spinning him around and pulling out his handcuffs. Silas Grimwald, you're under arrest for... He paused, realizing he had no idea what to charge the man with. Theft of corpses? Fraud? Desecration of human remains? You can't arrest me, Grimwald said calmly, as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Don't you understand? I'm on the verge of the greatest discovery in human history. Death doesn't have to be final, Sheriff. I can prove it. The basement door burst open, and what emerged made both Crankshaw and Wigglesworth stumble backward. They weren't quite walking. It was more of a shuffling, jerking movement, as if invisible strings were pulling them along. 7 figures in various states of decomposition, all wearing the formal clothes they'd been buried in, all with their mouths open in that endless, tuneless humming. Crankshaw recognized them all. Jedediah Plunkett, the baker. Constance Weatherby, the schoolteacher. Obadiah Thistlebottom, the bank manager. People he'd known, people whose funerals he'd attended, people whose families believed they were at rest in Millhaven Cemetery. They respond to certain frequencies, Grimwald said, his voice taking on a lecturer's tone despite the handcuffs. The combination of the preservation chemicals and electrical stimulation creates a resonance in the nervous system. They're not conscious, not exactly, but they're not gone either. They exist in a state between states. Make them stop, Crankshaw ordered, fighting down his revulsion. Whatever you've done to them, make it stop. I can't, Grimwald said simply. Once the process begins, it has to run its course. They'll return to dormancy eventually, probably within an hour or 2. The chemical reaction isn't sustainable without continuous application. As if responding to his words, the corpses began to move more purposefully, spreading out across the preparation room. Their humming grew louder, taking on an almost melodic quality that made Crankshaw's skin crawl. We need to get out of here, Wigglesworth said urgently. "Sheriff, we need backup. We need the state police. We need—" One of the corpses, Constance Weatherby, turned toward them with jerky, bird-like movements. Her dead eyes seemed to focus on Wigglesworth, and she took a shuffling step in his direction. The deputy raised his weapon with shaking hands. "Don't shoot!" Grimwald cried out. "You don't understand. They're still people. They're still—" The sound of shattering glass cut him off. More figures were pressing against the windows from inside, their hands leaving smears on the glass. How many more were down in that basement? "Out!" "Now!" Crankshaw ordered, pushing both Grimwald and Wigglesworth toward the exit. They burst through the front door into the humid night air, and Crankshaw had never been so grateful to be outside. He shoved Grimwald into the back of his patrol car and grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Crankshaw. I need every available unit at Grimwald's funeral home immediately, and contact the state police. Tell them we have a situation that defies easy explanation." As he waited for backup, Crankshaw watched the funeral home. Through the lit windows, he could see shadows moving in ways that shouldn't be possible, and that horrible humming continued to drift out into the night. Beside him, Wigglesworth was pale and shaking. "Sheriff," the deputy said quietly, "what are we going to tell the families?" Crankshaw didn't have an answer. How did you tell someone that their loved one's funeral had been a lie? That the person they'd mourned and buried was actually being kept in a madman's basement, subjected to experiments that blurred the line between death and something else? "We tell them the truth," he said finally, "whatever that turns out to be." By dawn, the state police had arrived along with a hazmat team and several officials from the Arkansas Department of Health. The bodies, Crankshaw refused to think of them as anything else, had indeed returned to dormancy as Grimwald predicted. They were carefully removed and transported to the state medical examiner's office for proper examination and eventual release to their families. The basement revealed worse horrors. Not just the 14 recent dead, but evidence of years of experimentation. Grimwald had kept meticulous records, documenting his attempts to bridge what he called the gap between cessation and conclusion. Some of his notes dated back 20 years. The investigation that followed would haunt Sheriff Elijah Crankshaw for the rest of his days. What they found in Silas Grimwald's records wasn't just the work of a madman. It was the systematic documentation of a decades-long obsession that had infected the very heart of Millhaven. 3 days after the initial discovery, Crankshaw sat in his office with State Police Detective Mordecai Blackthorne, a thin man with sharp features who'd been sent from Little Rock to help make sense of the situation. Spread across Crankshaw's desk were dozens of Grimwald's journals, photographs, and chemical formulas that neither man fully understood. "According to these records," Blackthorne said, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles, "Grimwald has been conducting these experiments since at least 1974. That's 20 years, Sheriff. 20 years of families thinking their loved ones were at peace." Crankshaw rubbed his tired eyes. He'd barely slept since that night at the funeral home. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those bodies moving with their mechanical breathing, heard that horrible humming. How many victims are we talking about? "That's the thing," Blackthorne replied, pulling out a ledger marked with dates going back 2 decades. "Grimwald doesn't see them as victims. In his mind, he was giving them a chance at something more. He has detailed notes on over 200 subjects, as he calls them." 200? Crankshaw felt sick. "That's impossible. We'd have noticed." "Would you?" Blackthorne interrupted gently. "Think about it, Sheriff. He didn't keep them all. According to these notes, he would select specific subjects based on certain criteria: age, cause of death, physical condition. He'd conduct his experiments, then properly bury or cremate them before families became suspicious. The ones you found that night were just his most recent batch. Crankshaw stood and walked to his window, looking out at Main Street. Millhaven looked so normal, so peaceful. People went about their business, shopping at Henderson's General Store, having lunch at the Copper Kettle Diner. How many of them had buried family members who'd been subjected to Grimwald's experiments? "We have to tell them," he said quietly. "The families have a right to know." "The State Attorney General's office is advising against full disclosure," Blackthorne said carefully. "The panic it would cause, the lawsuits, the trauma of not knowing if your loved one was among the experimented upon. They're suggesting a limited statement about improper handling of remains." "That's not enough." Crankshaw turned back to face the detective. These people trusted Grimwald with their most vulnerable moments. They trusted him with their dead. A knock at the door interrupted them. Deputy Wigglesworth entered, his face grave. "Sheriff, we've got a problem. Widow Thornberry is here, and she's demanding to speak with you. She says she knows about others." Mehitable Thornberry sat in the station's small interview room, her weathered hands folded in her lap. At 78, she was one of Millhaven's oldest residents, having lived in the town her entire life. Her husband Josiah had been buried in Millhaven Cemetery 15 years ago, or so she'd believed. "I always wondered," she said without preamble when Crankshaw entered. "Josiah looked wrong in his casket. Not peaceful, like they're supposed to look. His face was twisted, like he'd been struggling with something." "Mrs. Thornberry, let me finish, Sheriff. I need to say this." She took a deep breath. "I started watching after that, started paying attention at funerals, and I noticed things, little things. Hands positioned strangely, makeup not quite covering marks on necks. And the smell, sometimes there was this chemical smell under all the flowers, something that made your eyes water if you got too close." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook. "I started keeping track, writing down what I noticed. I have 43 names here, Sheriff. 43 funerals over the past 15 years where something seemed wrong." Crankshaw took the notebook with numb fingers. The names were all familiar. People he'd known, whose services he'd attended. Beside each name, Mehitable had made careful notes. Bruising on wrists visible despite makeup. Strange position of head. Chemical smell very strong. Grimwald seemed nervous during viewing. "Why didn't you say anything before?" Crankshaw asked. Mehitable's eyes filled with tears. "Who would have believed me? An old widow making wild accusations about the town's respected mortician? And part of me didn't want to know. If Josiah had been, if something had been done to him, I couldn't bear the thought." That afternoon, Crankshaw and Blackthorne descended into the funeral home's basement with a full forensics team. What they found there defied belief. Grimwald had constructed an elaborate laboratory hidden behind what appeared to be a simple storage area. Examination tables with leather restraints. Electrical equipment that looked like it belonged in a hospital from the 1950s. Shelves of chemicals and preservatives. Some labeled with formulae that the hazmat team couldn't identify. But it was the cold storage area that proved most disturbing. Behind a heavy door marked with temperature warnings, they found them. Not bodies. Grimwald had been telling the truth when he said the recent ones were all they'd kept. Instead, they found samples. Hundreds of small vials, each carefully labeled with a name and date, containing tissue samples from what Grimwald's notes called his subjects. He was collecting them, Blackthorne said, his professional composure finally cracking. Like a scientist collecting specimens. He has tissue samples from every single person he experimented on. Among the samples, they found one labeled Josiah Thornberry, 1979, promising respiratory response to Formula 17. The full extent of Grimwald's experiments became clearer as they decoded his journals. He believed he had discovered a way to maintain certain biological functions after death through a combination of electrical stimulation and a proprietary mixture of chemicals, some derived from rare plants that grew in the Arkansas Hill Country. His grandfather had apparently stumbled upon the basic formula while trying to preserve bodies during the Civil War, when embalming supplies were scarce. The humming, Grimwald had written in one entry, appears to be an involuntary response of the vocal cords to the electrical current. It varies in pitch and rhythm based on the individual's physical structure. I've begun to wonder if it might be some form of communication, though I cannot decode its meaning. Another entry, dated just a month before his arrest, was even more disturbing. Subject 194, Ezekiel Brandywine, showed remarkable preservation. Despite being clinically dead for 72 hours before treatment, muscular response was achieved within 6 hours of application. The eyes tracked movement for nearly 30 minutes before returning to fixed dilation. I am convinced that consciousness, or some echo of it, persists far longer than medical science believes. Crankshaw found himself assigned to interview Grimwald in the county jail while awaiting trial. The mortician had been deemed mentally competent by state psychiatrists, though they noted an unusual detachment from conventional moral frameworks. He seemed eager to talk, especially about the scientific aspects of his work. "You have to understand, Sheriff," Grimwald said during their third interview, his hands gesturing animatedly despite the shackles. "Death isn't an event, it's a process. And that process can be slowed, manipulated, even partially reversed. What I was doing wasn't desecration, it was exploration." "You were experimenting on people without consent," Crankshaw said flatly. "You lied to grieving families." "I gave them perfect funerals," Grimwald countered. "Beautiful services, peaceful viewings. They saw what they needed to see. And afterward, when my work was complete, I gave their loved ones proper burials. The families were never harmed by knowledge they couldn't understand." "What about the ones who responded? The ones who showed signs of whatever it was you thought you were achieving?" Grimwald's eyes lit up with an enthusiasm that made Crankshaw's skin crawl. "Ah, those were the special ones. The ones who proved my grandfather's theories correct. You see, Sheriff, the boundary between life and death isn't a wall. It's more like a twilight zone, a gray area where certain functions can persist with the right encouragement." "You're talking about reanimation," Crankshaw said. "You're talking about bringing back the dead." No, Grimwald shook his head impatiently. "Not bringing them back. They're gone, the consciousness, the soul, whatever you want to call it. But the body remembers things. Muscle memory, cellular functions, electrical patterns in the nervous system. With the right stimulation, these can be activated even after what we call death." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I had one subject, a young woman who died in a car accident. 3 days after death, I achieved full muscular response. She sat up, Sheriff. Her eyes opened. For just a moment there was something there, looking back at me. Not the woman herself, but an echo, a shadow of what had been. What happened to her? The same thing that happens to all of them eventually. The process isn't sustainable. The chemicals break down, the electrical patterns dissipate. The body returns to true death. But for those few moments or hours, something persists. Something that shouldn't exist, but does." The interview was interrupted by Deputy Wigglesworth, who knocked urgently on the door. "Sheriff, you need to come quickly." There's been an incident at the cemetery. Millhaven. Cemetery occupied 20 acres on the eastern edge of town. A peaceful place shaded by ancient oak trees. Or it had been peaceful. Now, a section near the back had been cordoned off with yellow tape, and several deputies stood guard while a growing crowd of townspeople gathered at a respectful distance. Started about an hour ago, Wigglesworth explained as they approached. Groundskeeper was doing his morning rounds when he noticed the ground here was disturbed. Not just one grave, a whole section. Crankshaw looked at the area in question and felt his heart sink. 7 graves showed signs of disturbance, not excavated, but the earth above them was churned and displaced, as if something had moved beneath it. Small mounds of dirt were pushed up in patterns that made no sense. These are all recent burials, Wigglesworth continued, consulting his notebook. All within the last 2 months. All prepared by Grimwald before his arrest. One of the graves belonged to Cornelius Moldcrum, one of the bodies they'd found that night in the funeral home. His family had insisted on immediate burial after the body was released, wanting to put the nightmare behind them. Now, the earth above his grave showed a distinctive pattern of upheaval, forming what almost looked like a path from the grave to the cemetery fence. "You think?" Wigglesworth couldn't finish the question. "No," Crankshaw said firmly. "Whatever Grimwald did to these people, they're dead. They're not climbing out of graves. This is something else. Maybe ground settling, maybe animals." But even as he said it, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the soft earth, near Moldcrum's headstone, there were marks that looked disturbingly like finger impressions, as if someone had clawed at the ground from below. That evening, Crankshaw made a decision that went against state recommendations. He called a town meeting at Millhaven Baptist Church, the only building large enough to hold everyone who wanted answers. Nearly the entire town showed up, filling every pew and lining the walls. "I'm going to tell you the truth," Crankshaw began, standing at the pulpit and looking out at the sea of familiar faces. "All of it. You deserve to know what's been happening in our town." He told them everything. Grimwald's experiments, the preserved bodies, the tissue samples, the decades of deception. He told them about the journals and the formulas, and the horrible possibility that their loved ones had been subjects in a madman's attempt to blur the line between life and death. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Some people wept. Others shouted in anger. A few simply sat in stunned silence, unable to process what they were hearing. "What about the cemetery?" someone called out. "What's happening to the graves?" "We're investigating," Crankshaw said. "We don't have answers yet, but we will. I promise you that." Old Zachariah Dankworth stood up in the back row, his voice shaking with rage. "My wife Hepzibah died 5 years ago. Grimwald handled her funeral. Are you telling me that monster experimented on her?" "We're reviewing all of Grimwald's records," Crankshaw replied. "Anyone who wants to know if their family member was affected can request that information from my office. And what good does knowing do?" This from Patience Wickwright, whose husband had died just 6 months ago. "What comfort is there in learning that our dead were violated?" Crankshaw had no good answer for that. The town meeting had ended in chaos, with families demanding exhumations, others insisting their loved ones be left in peace, and a small but vocal group calling for Grimwald to face immediate justice without trial. Sheriff Crankshaw had managed to maintain order, but barely. As people filed out of the church into the humid night, he could feel the fabric of Millhaven's close-knit community beginning to tear. It was Deputy Wigglesworth who made the next disturbing discovery. 3 days after the town meeting, he was reviewing security footage from a camera the state police had installed at the cemetery when he noticed something peculiar. "Sheriff, you need to see this," he said, entering Crankshaw's office with a laptop under his arm. "This is from last night around 3 a.m. The grainy black and white footage showed the section of cemetery where the grave disturbances had occurred. For several minutes, nothing moved except tree branches swaying in the wind. Then, at 3:14 a.m., something emerged from the shadows near the fence. It was a figure, hunched and moving with an odd, shuffling gait. It approached Cornelius Moldcrumb's grave and knelt beside it, remaining there for nearly 20 minutes before shuffling away into the darkness. "Could be anyone," Crankshaw said, though something about the figure's movement disturbed him. "Probably someone grieving, visiting after hours." "That's what I thought too," Wigglesworth said, "until I enhanced the image." He clicked a few keys, and the image zoomed in on the figure's face, visible for just a moment as it passed under a streetlight near the cemetery entrance. The face was gaunt, the eyes sunken, the skin with an unmistakable grayish pallor. But the features were recognizable. It was Cornelius Moldcrum. "That's impossible," Crankshaw said flatly. "Moldcrum is dead. We buried him ourselves. This is someone playing a sick joke." But even as he said it, he remembered the mechanical breathing, the horrible humming, the way those bodies had moved in Grimwald's funeral home. He thought of the finger marks in the disturbed earth above Moldcrum's grave. "There's more," Wigglesworth said quietly. He pulled up footage from the previous 4 nights. Each showed similar figures visiting the cemetery, always between 2 and 4 a.m., always moving with that same shuffling gait. One looked like Prudence Witherspoon. Another resembled Ezekiel Brandywine. "We need to verify these graves haven't been disturbed from the outside," Crankshaw said, his mind racing. "Get a team together." "We're doing this quietly. No need to panic the town further." That afternoon, under the pretense of maintenance work, they examined the disturbed graves more carefully. What they found defied explanation. The coffins were intact, but ground-penetrating radar showed unusual voids in the soil around them, as if something had moved through the earth itself without actually digging. Dr. Thaddeus Mumford from the State Forensics Lab was called in to consult. A small man with nervous habits and thick glasses, he spent hours analyzing soil samples and reviewing Grimwald's chemical formulas. "Sheriff, I'm going to tell you something that goes against every scientific principle I hold dear," he said finally, pulling off his glasses to clean them obsessively. "These chemicals Grimwald was using, some of them are completely unknown to modern science. The molecular structures don't make sense. They shouldn't exist, let alone function." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that whatever Grimwald injected into those bodies, it's still active. The compounds are breaking down very slowly, releasing energy as they do. It's possible, and I can't believe I'm saying this, that this chemical reaction could cause involuntary movement in dead tissue for weeks, maybe months after application." "Movement? Like walking around and visiting graves?" Dr. Mumford shook his head. "Not conscious movement. Think of it more like a wind-up toy, slowly unwinding. The muscles contract and release based on chemical signals, creating motion without intent or awareness. The body moves, but there's no mind directing it. Then, how do they find their way to the cemetery? That's what I can't explain. Unless..." Mumford paused, looking uncomfortable. "There's a theory in neuroscience about cellular memory. The idea that certain patterns of behavior become so ingrained that they persist at a cellular level. These people visited this cemetery in life, walked these paths. Perhaps the chemical reaction is somehow triggering these deeply embedded patterns." It was a theory that raised more questions than it answered, but it was all they had. That night, Crankshaw positioned himself in the cemetery with deputies Wigglesworth and 2 state troopers. They waited in the darkness, weapons ready but with strict orders not to engage unless absolutely necessary. Crankshaw still wasn't convinced they'd see anything. Part of him hoped the video footage had been some elaborate hoax. At 2:47 a.m., his doubts were shattered. They came from different directions, emerging from the woods that bordered the cemetery's eastern edge. 3 figures moving with that distinctive shuffling gait the cameras had captured. In the moonlight, Crankshaw could see their burial clothes. Mold Crumb in his best Sunday suit, Prudence Witherspoon in the blue dress her family had chosen for her viewing, and a third figure he recognized as Barnabas Creekmore, the town's former barber who had died 2 weeks ago. "Nobody move," Crankshaw whispered into his radio. "Just observe." The figures moved through the cemetery with apparent purpose, each going to their own grave. They stood there, swaying slightly, making no sound except for the rustling of their clothes in the wind. Mold Crumb's hands moved in small, repetitive gestures, as if he were dealing cards. Something his widow had mentioned he did constantly in his final years, even in his sleep. After about 15 minutes, they began to move again, but not back toward the woods. Instead, they converged on a single point, a freshly dug grave prepared for a funeral the next morning. They stood around it in a rough circle, their heads tilted down as if looking into the empty hole. Then they began to hum. It was the same tuneless, horrible humming Crankshaw had heard in the funeral home, but now there was something almost ritualistic about it. The 3 figures stood perfectly still, their voices creating a discordant harmony that made Crankshaw's teeth ache. "Should we intervene?" Wigglesworth's voice crackled over the radio. Before Crankshaw could answer, the figures stopped humming and began to walk away, each returning to the direction from which they'd come. Within minutes, they had vanished into the darkness of the woods. "Follow them," Crankshaw ordered. "Carefully. I want to know where they go." The team split up, each tracking one of the figures. Crankshaw himself followed Mold Crumb's trail, using night vision equipment to maintain visual contact while staying at a safe distance. The figure moved through the woods with surprising steadiness, following what seemed to be an established path. After about a mile, the trail led to an old storm cellar on the abandoned Wickford property. The heavy wooden doors were standing open, and Mold Crumb descended into the darkness below. Crankshaw waited several minutes before approaching, then carefully made his way down the stone steps. The cellar was larger than expected, extending well beyond the foundation of the long demolished house above. And it wasn't empty. 7 figures stood against the walls, perfectly still, like mannequins in storage. All were people who had died in recent months, all prepared by Grimwald before his arrest. In the center of the cellar was something else, a complex arrangement of copper pipes and glass containers connected by rubber tubing, all surrounding what looked like an old electric chair that had been heavily modified. The apparatus was humming with electricity, despite the property having been without power for decades. "Sheriff, you reading this?" Wigglesworth's voice came through the radio. "I followed Witherspoon to another cellar about a half-mile from your position. Same situation, multiple bodies, some kind of machinery." The third trooper reported similar findings at a third location. "Don't approach the bodies," Crankshaw ordered. "Pull back and establish a perimeter. We're calling in the hazmat team." As he backed toward the stairs, one of the figures against the wall moved its head slightly, tracking his movement. It was Minerva Golightly, the town librarian who had died of pneumonia 3 weeks ago. Her eyes were open but unfocused, and her mouth moved as if trying to form words. By dawn, 3 sites had been secured, and 17 animated corpses had been discovered. The machinery in each cellar was carefully documented and dismantled by specialists, who determined that Grimwald had somehow created self-sustaining electrical generators powered by the chemical decomposition of organic matter, essentially using the bodies themselves as batteries. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. Grimwald hadn't just been experimenting on the dead. He had been creating some kind of network, connecting multiple sites through underground cables that followed old mining tunnels from Millhaven's coal mining days. When confronted with this discovery, Grimwald's demeanor changed. The enthusiastic scientist was replaced by something colder, more calculating. "You've found the first phase," he said simply. "There are more sites, many more. Not just in Millhaven, but throughout the county. My grandfather started this work. My father continued it, and I've brought it near to completion." "Completion of what?" Crankshaw demanded. "A new form of preservation," Grimwald replied. "True preservation. Not just of the body, but of the essence, the patterns that make us who we are. Those people you found, they're not dead, Sheriff, not completely. Part of them persists in the network, connected through the electrical field generated by the apparatus." "You're insane." "Am I? You've seen them walking. You've heard them humming in unison. They're synchronized, Sheriff. Connected. What remains of their consciousness exists in a shared state. Neither alive nor dead, but something else entirely." "Where are the other sites?" Crankshaw asked. Grimwald smiled, an expression that made Crankshaw want to punch him. "I'll tell you, but only if you agree to preserve my work. Some of it, at least, for science, for the future. This is bigger than your small-town morality, Sheriff. This is about transcending death itself." Crankshaw stood to leave. "The state police will get the locations from you one way or another." "Perhaps," Grimwald called after him, "but they'd better hurry. The network is unstable without maintenance, and when it fails, well, you've seen what those bodies can do when they're partially animated. Imagine what happens when the controlling mechanism breaks down entirely." Over the next 48 hours, teams working from Grimwald's reluctantly provided information located 12 more sites throughout the county. Each contained between 10 and 20 preserved bodies, all connected to the same type of apparatus. The full scope of the operation was staggering. Over 200 bodies in various states of chemical preservation and electrical animation. The decision was made to simultaneously disconnect all sites to prevent any kind of cascading failure. Hazmat teams worked in coordination, shutting down the machinery and preparing the bodies for proper burial or cremation according to family wishes. But something went wrong at the 7th site. Deputy Wigglesworth was part of the team assigned to a cellar beneath the old Millhaven Tuberculosis Sanatorium, abandoned since 1953. The moment they began disconnecting the apparatus, the bodies reacted violently. Not with the slow, shuffling movement they'd observed before, but with sudden, thrashing motion. "They're convulsing," someone shouted over the radio, all of them at once. The hazmat team retreated as the bodies began pulling free from the copper wires that connected them to the machinery. One figure, identified as former town councilman Josiah Blackwood, actually stood up and took several lurching steps before collapsing. Then the humming started, not from one or two, but from all of them, creating a sound that could be heard above ground. Windows in nearby buildings cracked from the vibration. The hazmat team reported feeling dizzy, disoriented, some claiming they could hear voices in the humming. "Get everyone out," Crankshaw ordered. "Clear the building." As the team evacuated, something extraordinary happened. The humming stopped, and for just a moment a voice emerged from the chaos, clear, distinct, and impossibly, recognizably that of Josiah Blackwood. "Please," the voice said. "Let us go." Then silence. When the team re-entered an hour later, they found all the bodies had returned to true death, showing obvious signs of rapid decomposition, as if whatever had been preserving them had suddenly ceased. The machinery was dead, its copper pipes tarnished and glass containers cracked. The simultaneous failure at all sites created a crisis that stretched Millhaven's resources to the breaking point. Within hours of the shutdown, over 200 families had to be notified that their loved ones' remains had been recovered from Grimwald's network. The county brought in grief counselors, clergy from neighboring towns, and additional law enforcement to maintain order as the full horror of the situation became clear. Sheriff Crankshaw worked 36 hours straight coordinating the response. By the time he finally collapsed in his office chair for a few hours of sleep, he'd aged years in days. The images haunted him. Those bodies standing in dark cellars, connected by copper wire and strange chemicals to machines that shouldn't exist, maintaining some horrible parody of life weeks or months after death. It was Deputy Wigglesworth who woke him with news that would change everything. "Sheriff, we found something at the old Grimwald property. The family home, not the funeral parlor. You need to see this." The Grimwald family home sat on a hill overlooking Millhaven, a sprawling Victorian mansion that had been in the family for 4 generations. Silas had lived there alone since his father's death in 1989, and the property had been sealed since his arrest. The state police had done a cursory search but found nothing relevant to the criminal case. They'd missed the sub-basement. Hidden behind a false wall in the regular basement, accessible only through a mechanism built into what appeared to be a solid stone foundation, was a stairway descending another 20 feet into the earth. The construction was old, much older than the house above. The Historical Society says there are records of a structure here dating back to the 1850s, Wigglesworth explained as they descended. Before the Grimwalds. Before the town was properly founded. Some kind of religious commune lived here, called themselves the Eternal Preservation Society. The sub-basement opened into a vast circular chamber carved from solid bedrock. The walls were covered in symbols and text, some in English, some in languages Crankshaw didn't recognize. But it was what occupied the center of the chamber that stopped him cold. A perfectly preserved human body lay on a raised stone platform, surrounded by an incredibly complex arrangement of copper pipes, glass vessels, and what looked like early electrical equipment, far more sophisticated than anything they'd found at the other sites. The body was that of an elderly man in clothing from the mid-1800s. According to a brass plate on the platform, this was Theophilus Grimwald, Silas's great-great-grandfather and the founder of Grimwald Funeral Home. But Theophilus Grimwald's eyes were open, and they tracked Crankshaw's movement as he entered the chamber. "Jesus Christ," Wigglesworth breathed. "Don't say it." Crankshaw cut him off. He approached the platform slowly, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon, though he knew it would be useless here. The body couldn't speak. The apparatus that preserved it didn't allow for that. But the eyes were alert, aware, undeniably conscious in a way that none of the other preserved bodies had been. On a table nearby lay dozens of journals, the oldest dating back to 1851. The first entry, written in Theophilus Grimwald's hand, told the story. "I have discovered the secret that has eluded mankind since Eden, the preservation of consciousness beyond the failure of flesh. The indigenous peoples of this land knew parts of it. The ancient Egyptians understood other aspects, but I have combined their knowledge with modern scientific principles to achieve true preservation. Not mere mummification, not the false sleep of suspended animation, but a genuine continuation of awareness beyond death. I submit myself as the first complete test. If you are reading this, then I have succeeded." The journals that followed, written by successive generations of Grimwalds, documented their attempts to understand and perfect Theophilus's work. Each generation had added to the network, improved the chemicals, refined the electrical systems. Silas hadn't been a lone madman. He'd been the latest in a family tradition stretching back more than a century and a half. "We need to evacuate this site," Crankshaw said. "Get the state police, the FBI, whoever deals with this." But as they turned to leave, every piece of electrical equipment in the chamber suddenly activated. The humming that filled the air wasn't the monotonous drone they'd heard before. It had rhythm, pattern, almost like speech. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds, and their flashlights flickered and died. In the darkness, illuminated only by the crackling electrical arcs between copper pipes, Theophilus Grimwald's body began to move. Not the jerky, mechanical movement of the others, but smooth, deliberate motion. He sat up on the platform, his preserved flesh creaking like old leather, and turned his head to look directly at Crankshaw. When he spoke, his voice came not from his mouth, but from the electrical apparatus itself, vibrating through the copper pipes in a sound that was barely human. "You have destroyed everything." "We stopped an abomination," Crankshaw replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "Abomination?" The word echoed through the chamber. "I preserved them. They existed in the network, together, forever. Now they are truly dead." "They were dead the moment they stopped breathing," Crankshaw said. "What you did, what your family did, was wrong." "Wrong?" Theophilus's preserved features couldn't form expressions, but something in his eyes conveyed infinite sadness. "I felt them all. Every consciousness preserved, connected. A choir of souls." Now, silence. The electrical activity intensified, and more voices joined Theophilus's, not from other bodies, but from the machinery itself, as if the copper and glass had somehow retained echoes of all who had been connected to the network. "Sheriff!" Wigglesworth grabbed his arm. "We need to get out now." But Crankshaw stood transfixed as the voices rose in volume. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Every person who had ever been connected to the Grimwald network over the past century and a half. He could hear fragments of words, names, pleas, and underneath it all, that horrible humming that had started it all. "They are angry." Theophilus's voice cut through the chaos. "They were at peace in the network. You have condemned them to true oblivion." The stone platform began to crack, fractures spreading across the floor of the chamber. Whatever power source had maintained this place for over a century was failing catastrophically. Crankshaw grabbed Wigglesworth and ran for the stairs as the chamber began to collapse behind them. They barely made it out before the entire sub-basement imploded, taking a significant portion of the house above with it. The sinkhole that remained was 30 feet deep and still settling when emergency crews arrived. Silas Grimwald watched the smoke rising from his family home from his cell window in the county jail. When Crankshaw came to inform him of what they'd found and what had been destroyed, the mortician showed no emotion. "So it ends," he said quietly. 4 generations of work destroyed by fear and ignorance. Your great-great-grandfather," Crankshaw began. "Is finally at peace," Grimwald interrupted. "True death, as you call it. Perhaps it's better this way. The network was never meant to last forever. Nothing is." "Those voices," Crankshaw said, "were they real? Were those people somehow still conscious in your network?" Grimwald was quiet for a long moment. "What is consciousness, Sheriff? Is it the firing of neurons? The movement of electricity through tissue? Or is it something more? My family believed that consciousness creates patterns. In the brain, in the body, in the very air around us. Those patterns can be preserved, maintained, even shared. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. Whether those voices were real consciousness or just electrical echoes, I can't say. But I choose to believe that we gave those people something beyond the darkness of the grave. A continuation, however strange, however impossible it might seem. The investigation continued for months. The full extent of the Grimwald network was mapped, revealing connections to similar operations in 3 other states, all run by families with ties to the original Eternal Preservation Society. All were shut down, their preserved bodies properly laid to rest. The final death toll was staggering. Over 3,000 bodies had been connected to various networks over the past century and a half. Most families chose not to know if their loved ones had been among them. The few who did request the information often regretted it. Millhaven never fully recovered. Within 2 years, nearly a third of the population had moved away, unable to live with the knowledge of what had happened beneath their feet for generations. The town cemetery was largely abandoned, its graves too tainted by association with Grimwald's experiments. Sheriff Crankshaw retired 6 months after the investigation concluded. The official reason was stress-related health issues, but those close to him knew the truth. He couldn't stop hearing the voices from that chamber, couldn't stop wondering if they'd destroyed something, more than just an abomination. Deputy Wigglesworth took over as sheriff and served with distinction for many years, but he never spoke of what they'd witnessed in that sub-basement. Some things, he reasoned, were better left buried. Silas Grimwald was convicted on multiple counts of abuse of a corpse, fraud, and various other charges. He received a life sentence, which he served quietly, spending his time writing letters to scientific journals that were never published, and maintaining that his work would one day be vindicated. He died in prison in 2001, 7 years after his arrest. His body was cremated immediately, the ashes scattered in an undisclosed location to prevent any possibility of his remains becoming a shrine for those who might seek to continue his work. But rumors persisted. Hunters reported strange humming sounds from deep in the woods on quiet nights. Families noticed graves that seemed to settle differently than they should, and occasionally, very occasionally, someone would report seeing a figure in old-fashioned clothing walking the back roads of what remained of Millhaven, moving with purpose toward some unknown destination. The Grimwald Funeral Home was demolished in 1995, the land salted and left empty. But locals say that on humid summer nights, when the conditions are just right, you can still smell that sick sweet chemical odor drifting on the wind. And if you listen carefully, beneath the sound of crickets and tree frogs, you might hear something else, a tuneless humming, as if the very earth remembers what was done there and continues the song that Silas Grimwald started. The official investigation files were sealed in 1996, classified for reasons never fully explained. But Sheriff Elijah Crankshaw kept his own copies, hidden in his home until his death in 2008. His widow found them while settling his estate, along with a note in his shaking handwriting. The Grimwalds were wrong to play God with the dead. But in stopping them, I wonder if we played God too. Those voices in the chamber, they didn't sound angry about being trapped. They sounded angry about being freed. I pray I'm wrong. I pray they were just echoes, electrical patterns with no meaning, because if they weren't, then we didn't save those people. We destroyed them. And that's a weight I'll carry into whatever comes after this life, hoping it's the peaceful oblivion we promised those souls, and not another network waiting in the darkness. The note was burned along with the files, as Crankshaw had requested. His widow, the former Constance Ashford, who had stood by him through the horror of those days, took the secret to her own grave 3 years later. Today, Millhaven is a ghost town in all but name. Its population dwindled to fewer than 300 souls. The younger generation knows nothing of the Grimwald network, and the older residents who remember maintain a careful silence. Some stories are too terrible to pass on, some truths too heavy for the next generation to bear. But in the basement of what was once the town library, behind a wall that nobody remembers building, there's a copper pipe that runs deep into the earth. And sometimes, if you press your ear against it, you can hear something that might be water moving through old plumbing, or might be wind trapped in the walls. Or it might be voices, hundreds of them, humming in unison, waiting patiently for someone to rebuild the network and let them speak again. The pipe remains undisturbed. Some doors, once closed, should never be reopened. And in the county records, filed away and forgotten, there's a single line in Sheriff Crankshaw's final report that perhaps sums up the entire horror better than any detailed investigation could. The dead should stay dead. Silas Grimwald forgot that. God help us, we almost forgot it too. Sheriff Nehemiah Brimstone had been keeping the peace in Harrowing Falls, Nebraska, for 19 years, when the first complaint came in about the Sourberry Diner. It was October 1991, and the corn harvest was in full swing, bringing the usual influx of seasonal workers to the small farming community of barely 2,000 souls. At 57, Brimstone was a methodical lawman who prided himself on knowing every family, every farm, and every secret in his jurisdiction. But the Sourberry Diner would prove to harbor a secret that would shake him to his core. The complaint came from a trucker named Obadiah Moldenhauer, who'd stopped at the diner during a cross-country haul. He'd stumbled into the sheriff's office on a Monday morning, visibly shaken and speaking so fast that Deputy Barnabas Thistlethwaite had to ask him to slow down 3 times before they could understand what he was saying. "There's something wrong with the meat at that diner," Moldenhauer insisted, his weathered hands trembling as he accepted a cup of coffee from the deputy. "I've been driving trucks for man seen at the diner, and his battered truck was found abandoned on a side road 2 miles from the restaurant." Brimstone organized a search of the surrounding area, bringing in volunteers from town and even a tracking dog from the state police. The dog led them on a confusing path that circled back to the diner property 3 times before losing the scent entirely. More disturbing was what they found in the woods behind the restaurant. Several patches of disturbed earth, too old to be related to Wormbrand's disappearance, but suspicious nonetheless. "Sheriff, you might want to see this," Deputy Thistlethwaite called out from near a creek bed. What he'd found was a piece of torn fabric caught on a thorn bush, stained with what looked like blood. Near it, partially buried under fallen leaves, was a wallet. The driver's license inside belonged to Marcus Grimsby, a traveling salesman who'd been reported missing 6 months earlier. He'd last been seen, according to the report, getting gas in Harrowing Falls. Brimstone felt a cold weight settling in his stomach. He ordered the search expanded and called for additional resources from the state police. By evening, they'd found personal belongings from 3 other missing persons, all travelers who'd passed through the area over the past 2 years. That night, Brimstone sat in his office studying missing person reports from a 5-state area. A pattern emerged that made his blood run cold. Over the past decade, at least 17 people had vanished along the stretch of Highway 29 that ran through Harrowing Falls. Not all at once, not enough to raise immediate suspicion, but steady enough to be more than coincidence. Drifters, truckers, traveling salespeople, people whose absence might not be immediately noticed. He thought about the special meat plates at the Sourberry Diner, about that distinctive sweet flavor. about Hepzibah's cold eyes and Parmelia's knowing smile. The thought that formed in his mind was so horrible he tried to push it away, but it kept returning. The next morning, Brimstone called Judge Josiah Ironwood for a search warrant. The judge, a cautious man who'd known the Sowerberry family for decades, was reluctant. "You're talking about one of the oldest businesses in town, Sheriff. Hepzibah Sowerberry is a pillar of the community. You better have more than suspicion. I have evidence linking the area around their property to at least 4 missing persons, Judge. That's enough for a warrant." The judge signed it, but warned, "You better be right about this, Nehemiah. If you're wrong, the whole town will turn against you." The raid was planned for dawn, when the diner would be closed and the family would likely be unprepared. Brimstone assembled a team, including state police and deputies from neighboring counties. As they surrounded the property in the pre-dawn darkness, Brimstone noticed lights on in the building despite the early hour. They entered through both the front and back doors simultaneously. In the main dining area, they found Hepzibah sitting at the counter, fully dressed, as if she'd been waiting for them. Parmelia stood behind her mother, her face pale but composed. "Sheriff Brimstone," Hepzibah said calmly, "I've been expecting you." "Hepzibah Sowerberry, we have a warrant to search these premises," Brimstone announced, though something about her demeanor unsettled him. "Search away," she replied. "You'll find what you're looking for in the basement cold storage. We've been very careful about preservation." The casualness of her admission stunned everyone. Deputy Thistlethwaite moved to handcuff her, but she held up a hand. "Before you do that, Sheriff, you should know that you've eaten here every week for 19 years. You've complimented our special meat plates dozens of times. The whole town has. What does that make all of you?" The basement door was behind the kitchen, secured with a heavy padlock that Hepzibah provided the key for without being asked. The wooden stairs descended into darkness, and the smell that wafted up was a mixture of cold metal and something organic that made several officers gag. What they found in that basement would haunt every person present for the rest of their lives. The cold storage area was larger than the diner above, extending into what must have been natural caves beneath the property. Industrial freezers lined one wall, their contents meticulously labeled with dates and what appeared to be codes. But it was the preparation area that revealed the true horror. Stainless steel tables, surgical-grade tools, and a professional meat processing setup that wouldn't have been out of place in a commercial slaughterhouse. On one table, partially processed, was evidence that confirmed Brimstone's worst fears. What remained was clearly human. "My God," Thistlethwaite whispered, backing toward the stairs. But Brimstone forced himself to continue examining the space. The freezers contained packages wrapped in butcher paper, each labeled with dates going back years. A ledger on a nearby desk documented everything in Hepzibah's neat handwriting. Dates, sources, yields, even customer feedback. The entries were businesslike, almost mundane in their horror. October 15th, 1989. Transient mail, approximately 180 pounds. Yield, 68 pounds, prime cuts, 15 pounds ground. Special orders filled for Harvest Festival. March 3rd, 1990. Traveling salesman, 165 pounds. Yield, 61 pounds prime, 12 pounds ground. Regular menu stock, page after page, year after year, documenting the transformation of human beings into menu items served to an unsuspecting community. When they emerged from the basement, Hepzibah was sitting exactly where they'd left her, her hands folded calmly on the counter. "You want to know why?" she said. It wasn't a question. "I want to know everything," Brimstone replied, his voice barely steady. My family came to this country from Eastern Europe in 1919, Hepzibah began. We were fleeing something worse than poverty. We were fleeing starvation. The famine that hit our village forced people to make terrible choices. My grandmother, she learned to survive by any means necessary. She taught my mother. My mother taught me. You're talking about cannibalism, Brimstone said, and the word hanging heavy in the air. I'm talking about survival that became tradition. Tradition that became business, Hepzibah corrected. When we opened this diner, we meant to serve regular food. But during the hard times in the 60s, when beef became expensive and customers scarce, we fell back on old knowledge. Just once, we told ourselves. Just to get through the lean months. But you didn't stop. No, because people loved it. The flavor, the tenderness, they couldn't get enough. And there were always drifters, people who wouldn't be missed. We were selective, careful. We provided a service the community wanted, even if they didn't know what they were really asking for. The state police took Hepzibah and Permelia into custody while the investigation continued. The diner was sealed, and hazmat teams began the grim work of cataloging and removing evidence. But for Sheriff Brimstone, the real horror was just beginning. He had to face the town. News of the arrests spread through harrowing falls like wildfire. Within hours, crowds had gathered outside the sheriff's station. Not in support, but in disbelief and anger. These weren't strangers defending strangers. These were people who'd eaten at the Sourberry Diner for decades, who'd celebrated birthdays there, held wedding receptions in its back room, gathered there after funerals to share memories over comfort food. "You're lying," shouted Zebulon Thistlethwaite, the bank manager, his face red with fury. "The Sourberrys are good people. This is some kind of mistake." Brimstone stood on the station steps, facing his community. He'd known most of these people his entire life, had protected and served them for nearly 2 decades. Now he had to tell them the truth that would shatter their world. "I wish I were lying," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "But the evidence is undeniable. The Sourberry Diner has been serving human flesh for at least 10 years, possibly longer. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Several people vomited on the spot. Others stood in shocked silence, their faces draining of color as the implications hit them. Martha Pennywhistle, who'd eaten at the diner 3 times a week for 15 years, fainted and had to be carried to Dr. Cornelius Blackwood's office. But not everyone accepted the truth immediately. "This is impossible," insisted Reverend Mordecai Pennebaker, clutching his Bible. "I've broken bread with the Sourberrys. They're members of my congregation. God-fearing people don't do such things." "The evidence is being processed by the state forensics lab," Brimstone replied. "DNA testing will confirm the identities of the victims. This isn't speculation. It's fact." The crowd dispersed slowly, people wandering off in a daze. Brimstone watched them go, knowing that the real trauma was just beginning. Every person in town would now have to live with the knowledge of what they'd unknowingly consumed, what they'd fed to their children, what they'd praised and recommended to visitors. That evening, Deputy Thistlethwaite brought troubling news from the state police. "Sheriff, they've finished the preliminary count from the freezers. They've found evidence of at least 23 individuals, and that's just what was in storage. Based on the ledgers, the actual number over the years could be much higher." "How much higher?" "The records go back to 1968, Sheriff. Conservative estimate, over 100 victims." Brimstone felt sick. 100 people, processed and served to an unsuspecting community over more than 2 decades. The scale of it was almost incomprehensible. The next day brought another revelation. Bathsheba Crankwell, the young waitress who'd recently started at the diner, came forward with information that added another layer to the horror. "I knew something was wrong," she told Brimstone, tears streaming down her face. "The meat came from a special freezer that only Mrs. Sowerberry and Permelia had keys to. They told me never to ask about it, said it was a family secret recipe, but sometimes late at night when I was closing up, I'd hear sounds from the basement, sounds that weren't right." "What kind of sounds?" "Like someone crying or calling for help, but muffled, distant. I told myself it was the wind or pipes or my imagination. I needed the job, Sheriff. I have a baby to feed. I didn't want to know." Further investigation revealed that Bathsheba wasn't the only employee who'd noticed strange things. Former workers came forward with stories of odd smells, unexpected late-night deliveries, and strict instructions never to enter certain areas of the restaurant. Most had quit rather than ask questions, moving on to other jobs and trying to forget their unease. The forensic examination of the basement revealed even more disturbing details. Behind what appeared to be a wall of shelving, investigators found a hidden room. Inside were personal effects from dozens of victims. Wallets, jewelry, clothing, all meticulously cataloged with dates and descriptions. It was a trophy room, a monument to the Sowerberry's crimes. Among the items was a journal, not in Hepzibah's handwriting but in an older script. It belonged to her mother, Clementine Sowerberry, and it told the origin story of the family's descent into darkness. The journal, written in a mixture of English and what linguists later identified as a Romanian dialect, described the 1921 famine that had devastated their village. Clementine wrote of watching her children starve, of the decision made by the village elders to survive by any means necessary. Those who died were consumed by those who lived. A desperate act that saved the community but destroyed its soul. "We thought it would end when we came to America," one entry read. "We thought we could forget, start fresh. But the hunger followed us. Not physical hunger. We had food here. It was a different hunger, a craving for the forbidden taste we'd acquired. We tried to resist, but the memory of it haunted us." The journal documented the family's first American victim, a vagrant who tried to rob their first restaurant in 1924. They'd killed him in self-defense, Clementine claimed, and then, rather than report it to authorities, they disposed of the body the only way they knew how. The pattern was established, justified by twisted logic and old-world superstition. Brimstone was reading this journal in his office when Dr. Blackwood arrived with urgent news from the medical examinations he'd been conducting on townspeople. "Sheriff, I've found something concerning. I've been testing blood samples from regular customers of the diner, looking for any diseases that might have been transmitted. What I found instead was unexpected." "What do you mean?" "There are unusual protein markers in the blood of long-term customers. Proteins that are only produced when human nervous tissue is consumed regularly over time. They're similar to what we see in cases of kuru, a disease found in Papua New Guinea, among tribes that practiced mortuary cannibalism." "Are people sick?" "Not yet, but these proteins can cause degenerative neurological conditions. Some of the older customers who ate there frequently are showing early signs: tremors, difficulty walking, cognitive decline. I'd attributed it to normal aging, but now..." The implications were staggering. Not only had the town been unwittingly engaging in cannibalism, but they might be facing a public health crisis as a result. That evening, Brimstone received a call from the state attorney's office. Hepzibah Sowerberry wanted to make a full confession, but she would only speak to him. The state prison interview room was cold and sterile, a far cry from the warm, grease-scented atmosphere of the diner. Hepzibah sat across from him, her hands folded on the metal table, looking older than her years but still maintaining that unsettling calm. "You want to know everything," she said, echoing her words from the arrest. "I need to know everything. The families deserve answers." "The families," she scoffed softly. "They loved what we served them." They came back, again and again, bringing their children, their friends. We gave them what they craved, even if they didn't know what it was. You gave them human flesh. We gave them the finest meat they'd ever tasted. Do you know why human flesh has that distinctive sweetness, Sheriff? It's the glycogen in the muscles, the complex sugars that develop in well-fed individuals. We were selective in our choices. Healthy travelers, well-nourished, clean. We provided quality. Anonymous tip came in yesterday, Ironfoot explained. Said if we wanted to know more about the Sourberry network, we should check the old walk-in freezer here. What they found inside confirmed that the Sourberries hadn't been operating alone. The freezer, which should have been empty and powered down, was running on a generator hidden in an adjacent room. Inside were packages identical to those found at the Sourberry diner, complete with the same labeling system. "There's more," Ironfoot said, leading Brimstone to a small office. "Look at these receipts." The papers showed transactions between Maggie's place and the Sourberry diner dating back 15 years. They'd been trading inventory, sharing their grotesque products across county lines to avoid depleting local victim pools too quickly. "Who owned this place?" Brimstone asked. "Woman named Magdalena Rotgut. Died in a car accident 3 years ago, which is when the place closed. But here's the interesting part. Her niece, Delilah Rotgut, just opened a new restaurant in Cedar Rapids. Real popular place, known for its specialty meat dishes." The investigation was expanding beyond anything Brimstone had imagined. Working with state and federal authorities, they uncovered a network of 5 establishments across 3 states, all connected through family ties dating back to the same Eastern European village the Sourberries had fled. Each location had its own variation on the theme. One posed as a barbecue joint, another as a German butcher shop. All had developed loyal customer bases who raved about the unique flavor of their meat products. The network had operated for decades, carefully selecting victims and sharing them across state lines to avoid creating recognizable patterns. Back in Harrowing Falls, the town was struggling to recover. The economic impact alone was devastating. The diner had been one of the largest employers, and its closure, combined with the exodus of traumatized residents, had left Main Street half empty. But it was the psychological toll that proved most severe. Dr. Cornelius Blackwood had identified 37 residents showing symptoms of the prion disease caused by long-term consumption of human neural tissue. The youngest was only 23, having grown up eating at the diner twice a week. The CDC established a long-term monitoring program, but there was no cure, only management of symptoms as they progressed. Support group meetings were held in the Baptist church every Tuesday evening. Brimstone attended one, sitting in the back, listening to his neighbors struggle with their trauma. "I can't eat meat anymore," said Prudence Weatherby, the school principal. "Any meat, the texture, the smell, it all reminds me of what we didn't know we were doing." "I have nightmares," added Zacharias Dungworth, the hardware store owner. "I dream about all those missing people. I see their faces in my food. I wake up sick every night." The group's facilitator, a trauma specialist brought in from Omaha, tried to help them process their experience. But how do you counsel people through something so far outside normal human experience? How do you help them forgive themselves for something they did unknowingly? One evening, Deputy Barnabas Thistlethwaite brought Brimstone a package that had been left at the station. Inside was a leather journal and a note. "Sheriff, you should know the whole truth. This belonged to my grandmother. BC, BC, Bathsheba Crankwell, the young waitress. The journal was written in Romanian and dated back to 1919. Brimstone had it translated by a professor at the State University, and what it revealed cast the entire case in an even darker light. The journal belonged to Elizabetta Sowerberry, Hepzibah's grandmother. It told of the original famine in their village, but with crucial details Hepzibah had omitted. The cannibalism hadn't been a desperate last resort. It had been orchestrated by a group of village elders who belonged to an ancient cult that believed consuming human flesh granted spiritual powers. "The old gods demand sacrifice," one passage read. "Through consumption of the consecrated flesh, we take in the essence of the offered. Their strength becomes ours. Their memories live within us." The cult had used the famine as cover for their practices, convincing starving villagers that they had no choice. When some families fled to America, they carried both the practice and the belief system with them. What had been presented as survival cannibalism was actually ritualistic, with specific preparations and ceremonies that the Sowerberrys had adapted to their restaurant operation. Brimstone confronted Hepzibah with this information during another prison interview. "You lied about the famine, about survival." This was religious, ritualistic. Hepzibah's composure cracked completely. "You wouldn't have understood. No one would." It's easier to be seen as desperate than devoted. Devoted to what? To the old ways. To the belief that we are what we eat in the most literal sense. Every person we prepared, we absorbed their essence. The town, without knowing it, took in the strength and memories of hundreds of travelers. It made harrowing falls stronger. It made them sick. It destroyed their lives. It made them part of something greater than themselves. Look at the town's history, Sheriff. No major crimes except ours. No serious violence. Prosperity, even during hard times. That wasn't coincidence. That was the blessing of the consumed. Brimstone wanted to dismiss her words as the ravings of a delusional killer, but something nagged at him. Harrowing Falls had indeed been unusually peaceful and prosperous compared to similar towns. Was it possible that number? He pushed the thought away. That way lay madness. The trial of Hepzibah and Permelia Sowerberry began in September 1992. The courthouse in the county seat was packed every day, with media from around the world covering what was being called the Cannibal Cafe case. The prosecution presented overwhelming physical evidence, while the defense attempted to argue for insanity. Permelia's testimony was particularly harrowing. She described being raised to see the family business as both burden and honor, taught from childhood that they were guardians of an ancient tradition. She spoke of ceremonies conducted in the basement during new moons, of prayers spoken in languages she didn't understand, of being told that stopping the practice would curse the family for 7 generations. "I wanted to leave," she wept on the stand. "When I married Harold, I thought I could escape. But Mother said the hunger would follow me, would transfer to my children. She said the only way to protect them was to continue the tradition. I was trapped between horror and duty." Harold Snodgrass, Permelia's husband, testified that he'd noticed his wife's strange relationship with the family business, but had never suspected the truth. He'd filed for divorce the day after the arrests, taking their 2 young children to live with relatives in another state. "I loved her," he said, his voice breaking, "but I can't forgive this. Our children ate at that diner, we all did. How do I explain to them what their mother did? How do I help them live with this?" The medical testimony was equally disturbing. CDC specialists explained the progression of Kuru-like symptoms in affected townspeople. They projected that within 10 years, at least half of the regular customers would show significant neurological decline. The younger the person, when they started consuming the tainted meat, the faster the progression would be. One of the most dramatic moments came when Obadiah Moldenhauer, the trucker whose complaint had started the investigation, was called to testify. "I knew something was wrong," he said. "Every instinct told me that meat wasn't right, but I almost went back. That's the thing that haunts me. Despite my revulsion, part of me wanted more. There was something about the taste that was compelling. If I hadn't reported it, if I'd just driven on, how many more people would have died?" The defense's case relied heavily on the family history of trauma and the psychological conditioning both women had endured. Expert witnesses testified about generational trauma, about how practices born from extreme circumstances could become pathologically embedded in family structures. But the most shocking testimony came from an unexpected source. Reverend Mordecai Pennebaker requested to speak as a character witness. Instead, he delivered a confession that stunned the courtroom. "I knew," he said, his voice barely audible. "Not the full truth, but I suspected. 5 years ago, I saw Hepzibah burning documents behind the diner late one night. Some pages blew away, and I retrieved them. They were in a foreign language, but there were diagrams that looked anatomical. Human anatomical." The courtroom erupted. The judge had to call for order multiple times. "Why didn't you report it?" the prosecutor demanded. "Because I was weak," Pennebaker admitted. "Because the Sowerberrys donated generously to the church. Because I told myself I was misinterpreting what I'd seen. Because the special meat plates were served at every church function, and everyone loved them. I chose ignorance over truth, comfort over righteousness. I am as guilty as anyone." His confession triggered a wave of similar admissions from townspeople. The owner of the local motel admitted he'd noticed the Sowerberrys often had late-night visitors who never checked in anywhere. The gas station attendant mentioned cars abandoned near the diner that the Sowerberrys always volunteered to have towed. The pattern of willful blindness extended throughout the community. Dr. Blackwood presented a theory during his testimony that became central to understanding the case's impact. "Harrowing Falls developed what I call collective selective blindness," he explained. "The diner was so central to the town's identity, so important economically and socially, that people unconsciously chose not to see warning signs. This is a documented psychological phenomenon in communities where a beloved institution is involved in wrongdoing. The mind protects itself by refusing to acknowledge what would be psychologically devastating to accept." As the trial neared its conclusion, one more revelation emerged that would haunt Brimstone forever. Among the evidence recovered from the hidden room in the diner's basement was a guest book, not for the restaurant, but for the special after-hours dinners where victims were lured. One entry, dated 18 years earlier, was in familiar handwriting. Sheriff Nehemiah Brimstone's own signature appeared next to a note. "Thank you for the wonderful private dinner." The meat was exceptional as always. Brimstone had no memory of this dinner, but the date coincided with a period when he'd been recovering from a shooting injury, taking strong pain medication that affected his memory. Had he been an unwitting participant in one of their ritual meals? Had he consumed human flesh knowingly, the drugs simply erasing the memory? The question tormented him. He submitted his resignation the day before closing arguments, unable to continue serving a community where he could no longer trust his own history. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the foreman, old Thaddeus Ironmonger, who'd run the feed store for 40 years, could barely look at the defendants as he delivered the verdict. "On the count of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant Hepzibah Sowerberry guilty on all 23 counts. On the count of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant Permelia Snodgrass guilty on 7 counts." The courtroom remained silent. There were no gasps of surprise, no cries of vindication. The town was too broken for such displays. Hepzibah received 23 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Permelia, due to evidence of psychological manipulation and her lesser role, received 7 concurrent life sentences with possibility of parole after 25 years. As they were led away, Hepzibah turned to look at the gallery one last time. Her eyes found Brimstone, who despite his resignation had come to see justice done. "The hunger doesn't die with us, Sheriff," she said clearly. "It's in the town now. In their blood, in their bones. They've tasted the forbidden fruit, and somewhere deep inside, they'll crave it forever." The bailiffs dragged her away, but her words lingered like a curse over the silent courtroom. In the months that followed, Harrowing Falls attempted to rebuild itself. Deputy Barnabas Thistlethwaite was elected as the new sheriff, promising to help the community heal. The state provided funding for mental health services, and the CDC established a permanent clinic to monitor and treat those showing symptoms of the prion disease. But the town was fundamentally changed. The local economy collapsed without the diner as its hub. Main Street businesses closed one by one, as people either moved away or simply stopped going out. The social fabric that had held the community together had been irreparably torn. More disturbing were the reports that began surfacing about 6 months after the trial. Pets were going missing at an unusual rate. Then livestock began disappearing from farms on the outskirts of town. Sheriff Thistlethwaite investigated, but found no clear evidence of theft or predation. It was Dr. Blackwood who first voiced the unspeakable possibility. "Sheriff, I've been tracking the medical data from our affected residents," he said during a private meeting. "The protein markers I mentioned, they're not decreasing as expected. In some patients, they're actually increasing. What does that mean? It means they're still consuming contaminated tissue. But that's impossible. The diner is gone, all the meat was destroyed. Unless—" Both men fell silent, neither wanting to complete the thought. But reports kept coming in. A hitchhiker who'd been seen getting a ride outside town but never arrived at their destination. A traveling salesman whose car was found abandoned on a rural road. The investigation that followed was conducted in absolute secrecy. What Thistlethwaite and Blackwood discovered was that a small group of townspeople, all former regular customers of the diner, had begun meeting in secret. They called themselves the Hungry and claimed they were suffering from an addiction they couldn't control. "It started a support group," confessed Josiah Kettlewell when finally confronted. "We met to talk about the cravings, the dreams about the taste. But talking made it worse. Made us remember how good it was. How satisfied we felt after eating there." "What did you do, Josiah?" Thistlethwaite asked, though he feared he already knew. "We tried regular meat. Beef, pork, even exotic meats from specialty suppliers. Nothing satisfied the craving, nothing tasted right. And then someone suggested we try to recreate the sourberry recipe." The group had been targeting the same type of victims the sourberries had chosen. Transients, loners, people who wouldn't be immediately missed. They'd been using an abandoned farmhouse as their processing location, following instructions from Hepzibah's seized journals. 7 members of the Hungry were arrested, including 2 prominent business owners and a retired school teacher. The revelation sent fresh shockwaves through the already traumatized community. The infection of evil the sourberries had introduced hadn't ended with their imprisonment. It had metastasized. Former Sheriff Nehemiah Brimstone, living in self-imposed exile on a farm outside the county, received word of these developments from Dr. Blackwood. He returned to Harrowing Falls one last time to visit Hepzibah in prison. "You knew this would happen," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I told you the hunger doesn't die," she replied. looking frailer but no less unsettling in her orange jumpsuit. Once awakened, it becomes part of you. The town wanted to blame everything on us, make us the monsters. But we only gave them what they craved. The monster was always inside them, waiting. There has to be a way to stop it. There is: complete destruction, burn, harrowing. Falls to the ground, scatter its people to the winds, salt the earth where it stood, break the community apart so thoroughly that the hunger can't spread. But you won't do that, will you, Sheriff? You still believe in redemption, in healing. She was right. Despite everything, Brimstone couldn't accept that the only solution was obliteration. But as more cases emerged, not just in Harrowing Falls but in surrounding communities where former residents had relocated, he began to wonder if Hephzibah's apocalyptic prescription might be the only answer. The CDC escalated their response, declaring a public health emergency. The story, which had faded from national attention after the trial, returned with renewed horror. Harrowing Falls became a quarantine zone, with residents required to undergo regular psychological evaluation and blood testing before being allowed to leave. A year after the trial, Hermelia Snodgrass was found dead in her cell, having fashioned a noose from bedsheets. She left a note that consisted of a single line: "The hunger grows stronger every day." Her death seemed to break something in Hephzibah. The next time Brimstone visited, he found her catatonic, staring at the wall and mumbling in Romanian. The prison psychiatrist said she hadn't spoken coherently in weeks, lost in delusions about ancient gods and eternal hunger. But Brimstone suspected it wasn't delusion. Late at night, he'd begun having dreams himself. Dreams where he could taste that distinctive sweetness, where his mouth watered at memories he wasn't sure were real. The guest book entry with his signature haunted him. Had he partaken knowingly? Was the hunger dormant in him too? By 1995, Harrowing Falls had effectively ceased to exist as a functioning town. The population had dwindled to less than 300, mostly elderly residents too poor or sick to relocate. The CDC clinic remained, as did a small law enforcement presence, but Main Street was abandoned, its empty buildings slowly being reclaimed by prairie grass and wind. The other locations in the Sowerberry network were investigated and shut down, their operators prosecuted. But reports of similar operations continued to surface in Mexico, Canada, Eastern Europe. The ancient cult Elisabetta Sowerberry had written about apparently had roots deeper and branches wider than anyone had imagined. Dr. Blackwood published a paper on what he termed culturally transmitted specific paraphilia, arguing that the combination of biological factors, the prion disease, and psychological conditioning could create a literally infectious form of cannibalistic desire. His research was controversial but gained support as more cases emerged. The final documented incident in Harrowing Falls occurred in December 1997. A family passing through on Highway 29 reported their teenage daughter missing after stopping for gas at the town's last functioning station. She was found 3 days later, alive but traumatized, in the basement of the old Sowerberry Diner site, where a group of 5 remaining residents had attempted to restart the operation. That was the end. The state government, with federal support, forcibly relocated all remaining residents and declared the entire township condemned due to environmental contamination. The buildings were demolished, the basements filled with concrete, the land designated as permanently uninhabitable. But the story didn't end there. Reports continue to surface, scattered across the Midwest, of restaurants with special meat dishes that draw devoted customers, of missing persons near highway diners, of small towns with unusual prosperity and peace, built on foundations no one wants to examine too closely. Sheriff Nehemiah Brimstone died in 2003, alone on his farm, His final journal entry, found by the estate executor, read, "I dream of it every night now. The taste, the satisfaction. I tell myself it's just a suggestion, just psychological contamination from the case. But I know the truth. I was at that dinner 18 years ago. I knew what I was eating. The medication didn't make me forget. It let me forget, let me live with myself. The hunger has always been in me, controlled, suppressed, but there. Hepzibah was right. We are all capable of becoming monsters. The only difference is that some of us choose not to feed the hunger. I have chosen to starve it, and it will die with me. I pray others are strong enough to do the same." The journal was burned by the executor, following Brimstone's explicit instructions. But copies of pages had already been made by someone. They surface occasionally on internet forums devoted to true crime, always accompanied by debates about their authenticity. The site where Harrowing Falls once stood is now marked only by a small sign on Highway 29. No services next 50 miles. Truckers sometimes report seeing lights where the town used to be, hearing the distant clatter of dishes and smelling food on the wind. But these stories are dismissed as urban legend, the kind of tales travelers tell to pass long, lonely hours on empty roads. Hepzibah Sowerberry died in prison in 2001, taking with her the full truth about the network, the cult, and the ancient hunger she claimed infected everyone who tasted her family's special recipes. Her body was cremated, the ashes scattered at sea to prevent any pilgrimages to her grave. But those who investigated the case, those who lived through it, know that she was right about one thing: the hunger doesn't die. It waits, patient and persistent, for the right conditions to resurface. In times of desperation, isolation, or moral confusion, it whispers its promise of satisfaction, of the forbidden feast that satisfies like nothing else can. Somewhere in America tonight, in a small-town diner or truck stop restaurant, someone is serving a special meat dish with that distinctive sweet flavor. The customers compliment the cook, ask for the recipe, come back again and again. They bring their families, their friends. They don't ask too many questions about where the meat comes from, or why it's so affordable despite its quality. They don't want to know. And in the kitchen, someone who learned from someone who learned from someone who once knew the Sowerberries is carefully preparing the next batch, selecting only the finest stock, personally chosen. The tradition continues, adapted, evolved, but essentially unchanged from those desperate days in a Romanian village when survival became something monstrous. The hunger, as Hepzibah promised, never truly dies. It just finds new places to feed. The first sign that something was terribly wrong at the Blessed Angels Adoption Agency came on a cold November morning in 1996. Sheriff Jedediah Weatherbottom had been serving the people of Millbrook County, Vermont, for 28 years, and at 63, he thought he'd seen the full spectrum of human cruelty and kindness. But the call that came in at 6:47 a.m. would prove that even after nearly 3 decades in law enforcement, there were still horrors he couldn't have imagined. The call came from Zephaniah Crabapple, a state investigator who'd been looking into irregularities in adoption records across New England. His voice carried an urgency that immediately set Weatherbottom on edge. "Sheriff, I need you to meet me at the Blessed Angels building, but don't go inside. Wait for me in the parking lot. And Jedediah, come alone. Don't mention this to anyone, not even your deputies." "Zephaniah, what's this about?" "I can't explain over the phone. Just trust me. And bring bolt cutters." The Blessed Angels Adoption Agency had been a fixture in Millbrook County since 1952, housed in a converted Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town. Run by Tabitha Gloomhaven and her staff, it had facilitated hundreds of adoptions over the decades, matching orphaned or unwanted children with loving families. Gloomhaven herself, now 71, was considered a pillar of the community, having dedicated her life to what everyone assumed was God's work. Weatherbottom arrived at the agency to find the parking lot empty, except for Crabapple's state-issued sedan. The investigator was leaning against his car, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands, unusual for a man who'd quit smoking 5 years prior. "You're going to think I'm insane," Crabapple said without preamble. "Hell, I think I'm insane, but I've triple-checked everything, and the evidence is undeniable. Slow down, Zeph. Start from the beginning." Crabapple took a deep breath. 6 months ago, I was assigned to investigate some discrepancies in adoption records across New England. Missing paperwork, children whose records didn't match up, adoptive parents who couldn't be located. Normal bureaucratic mess, I thought. But the deeper I dug, the more I found connections to this place. He pulled out a thick folder from his car, handing it to Weatherbottom. Inside were photocopies of adoption certificates, birth records, and death certificates, all bearing the Blessed Angel's letterhead. "Look at the dates," Crabapple said. "Look at the names." Weatherbottom studied the documents, his frown deepening. Some of these death certificates are dated after the adoption papers. Exactly. According to these records, Blessed Angels arranged adoptions for 17 children who were already dead. But that's not the worst part. Crabapple led him to a section of the building's exterior where a basement window had been painted over. Using the bolt cutters, he removed a padlock from a metal grate that looked newer than the building's Victorian architecture would suggest. "I was here last night," Crabapple admitted. "Unofficial reconnaissance. What I found, Sheriff, there are children down there. Living children, but also..." He trailed off, unable to finish. Weatherbottom felt his blood run cold. "We need backup. State Police, FBI..." "No," Crabapple interrupted. "Not yet. There are people involved in this, powerful people. If word gets out before we know the full scope, evidence will disappear, children will vanish. We need to document everything first." Against his better judgment, Weatherbottom followed Crabapple through the window into the basement. The smell hit them immediately. Disinfectant trying to mask something organic and wrong. The basement was larger than expected, extending well beyond the building's foundation. Emergency lighting cast sickly green shadows on concrete walls. They moved through a narrow corridor that opened into a larger space, and Weatherbottom had to suppress a gasp. The room contained 12 small cells, each no bigger than a walk-in closet, secured with heavy locks. Through the small windows in each door, he could see children, some sleeping on thin mattresses, others sitting in corners, ages ranging from perhaps 5 to 15. "My God," Weatherbottom whispered. "This is just the holding area," Crabapple said grimly. "There's more." They documented everything with Crabapple's camera, the cells, the children, the meticulous records kept in filing cabinets along one wall. The records were horrifyingly detailed, containing not just names and ages, but medical histories, psychological evaluations, and something called placement categories that made no immediate sense. Category A, Traditional Placement Category. B, Special Requirements. Category C, Medical Research. Category D, Terminal Procurement. Terminal Procurement, Weatherbottom read aloud, his voice catching. A sound from above made them freeze, footsteps, multiple sets, moving across the floor. It was now past 8 a.m. The agency was opening for business. "We need to get these children out," Weatherbottom said. "We can't." "Not yet. If we act now, we'll save these 12, but lose hundreds of others. This network is bigger than just Millbrook County. They retreated carefully. emerging from the basement as the morning sun climbed higher. Weatherbottom's hands were shaking as he locked the grate back in place. "I'm going to call in federal support," he said. "Quietly. We'll coordinate a simultaneous raid on all connected locations." "How long will that take?" 48 hours minimum. Can those children survive that long?" Crabapple nodded grimly. "They've survived this long. But Sheriff, there's something else you need to know." I cross-referenced the adoption records with missing persons reports from the past 40 years. Over 200 children who supposedly died in Blessed Angel's care match descriptions of missing children from other states. Different names, but same birthmarks, same medical conditions, same dates of disappearance. The implications were staggering. Blessed Angels hadn't just been facilitating illegal adoptions. They'd been trafficking children, faking deaths, and operating what amounted to a human inventory system. That afternoon, Weatherbottom returned to his office and began the delicate process of alerting federal authorities without raising local suspicions. He contacted Special Agent Bathsheba Wormwood from the FBI's Crimes Against Children Unit, a woman he'd worked with on a previous case involving child exploitation. "Jedediah, if what you're describing is accurate, this could be one of the largest child trafficking operations we've ever uncovered," Wormwood said over the secure line. "I'm mobilizing a team, but we need to be extremely careful. Operations like this usually have early warning systems, people on the inside of law enforcement." "You think we have a mole?" "I think you should trust no one, local except yourself and Crabapple. I'll be there in 18 hours with a team. In the meantime, maintain normal routines. Don't let anyone suspect you know anything." The next day and a half were the longest of Weatherbottom's career. He went through the motions of his regular duties, while his mind churned with images of those children in cells. He drove past Blessed Angels twice, noting the normal flow of prospective adoptive parents entering and leaving. Tabitha Gloomhaven's familiar figure greeting them at the door with her grandmotherly smile. How many children had passed through those doors? How many had never left? At least not through legal adoption. He pulled the agency's history, studying Tabitha Gloomhaven's background. Born in 1925 in Boston, trained as a nurse, moved to Millbrook County in 1950. Started Blessed Angels with an inheritance from a deceased uncle. Never married, no children of her own. Dedicated her life to helping orphans find loving homes. The record was too clean, too perfect. Real lives had blemishes, inconsistencies. This read like a carefully constructed legend. Agent Wormwood arrived as promised, accompanied by a tactical team disguised as utility workers. They set up a command post in an abandoned warehouse a mile from Blessed Angels, using it as a staging area for what would be a coordinated raid. "We've identified 7 connected locations across New England," Wormwood reported, all operating under different names but sharing financial connections, staff transfers, and most tellingly, child transfers. "We'll hit them all simultaneously at 3 a.m. "What about the locals, my deputies?" "We'll bring them in at the last minute. Anyone who's been in position for more than 5 years is potentially compromised. This operation has been running for decades. They've had plenty of time to place their people." That night, Weatherbottom couldn't sleep. He stood at his bedroom window, looking out at the peaceful town he'd protected for nearly 3 decades. How many secrets lay beneath Millbrook County's quaint exterior? How many children had suffered while he'd remained oblivious? At 2:30 a.m., he met the federal team at the warehouse. His 4 most trusted deputies, all relatively new to the force, were briefed and assigned positions. The raid would be swift and overwhelming, designed to prevent destruction of evidence or harm to the children. At exactly 3 a.m., they breached Blessed Angels from multiple entry points. Weatherbottom led the team through the front door, finding the main floor eerily quiet. They moved systematically through the building, clearing rooms, until they reached the basement access. The hidden entrance Crabapple had shown him was sealed, but there was another way down, through what appeared to be a supply closet but actually concealed a modern elevator. The federal tech specialist overrode the electronic lock, and they descended. What they found below exceeded even Weatherbottom's worst expectations. The basement complex was massive, extending far beyond what they'd initially discovered. Beyond the holding cells was a medical facility that looked like something from a dystopian nightmare. Operating tables, medical equipment, refrigeration units. On the walls were charts tracking blood types, organ compatibility, genetic markers. Category D, Wormwood said quietly. Terminal procurement. They were harvesting organs. In another section, they found what could only be described as a training facility. Rooms set up like home environments where children were apparently taught how to behave for their new families. The walls were covered with photographs of children at various ages, some with red X's marked through them. They found Tabitha Gloomhaven in an office deep within the complex, sitting calmly at her desk as if she'd been expecting them. She was destroying documents in an industrial shredder, but made no attempt to resist when they arrested her. "You're too late," she said with eerie calm. "The important files are already gone. And the children you're looking for, they've been relocated." "Where are they?" Weatherbottom demanded. She smiled, a cold expression that bore no resemblance to the grandmotherly facade she'd worn for decades. "Everywhere and nowhere, Sheriff. Do you have any idea how many people have adopted from us over the years? Senators, judges, CEOs, people who wanted children and didn't ask questions about where they came from. People who needed transplants and didn't care about the source. You're not uncovering a crime. You're dismantling an institution." The scale of the operation became clearer as they processed the evidence. Blessed Angels had been operating for 44 years, during which time they'd facilitated over 3,000 adoptions. But the real number of children who'd passed through their system was much higher. Many had simply disappeared, their fates recorded in coded ledgers that would take months to decipher. They rescued 37 children from the facility that night, ranging in age from 3 to 17. Some had been there for years, raised entirely within the underground complex. They didn't know their real names, their origins, or anything about the world above. One boy, perhaps 12 years old, looked at Weatherbottom with hollow eyes and asked, "Are you here to buy me?" The question haunted Weatherbottom more than anything else he encountered that night. The interrogation of Tabitha Gloomhaven began at dawn, conducted by Agent Bathsheba Wormwood with Sheriff Weatherbottom observing. The woman who had fooled an entire community for decades sat across from them in the federal facility's interview room, her demeanor unnervingly composed. She'd waived her right to an attorney, claiming she had nothing to hide. "Let's start with the basics," Wormwood began. "Your real name isn't Tabitha Gloomhaven, is it?" The elderly woman smiled slightly. "Names are just labels, Agent Wormwood. I've had many over the years. The woman you know as Tabitha Gloomhaven has existed since 1952. Isn't that real enough? We've found no birth records for anyone by that name before 1950. Your nursing credentials are forged. Your inheritance story is fabricated. Who are you, really?" "I am someone who saw an opportunity to provide a service," Gloomhaven replied. "After the war, there were so many displaced children, so many families desperate for babies they couldn't have naturally. Traditional adoption was slow, bureaucratic, weighted down by moral judgments about who deserved to be parents. I simply streamlined the process. You trafficked children. Weatherbottom interjected, unable to contain himself. You sold them like commodities. I matched children with families who wanted them, she corrected. Yes, money changed hands. Quality care requires funding. The facilities you discovered didn't build themselves. The medical facility, Wormwood said, sliding photographs across the table. The organ harvesting. Explain that. For the first time, Gloomhaven's composure flickered. That was never supposed to be the primary operation. It was a necessity that arose from circumstances. What circumstances? She sighed, suddenly looking every one of her 71 years. Not every child who came to us was adoptable. Some were too damaged, physically or mentally. Others were too old. People want babies, not teenagers with trauma. We could have turned them away, let them die on the streets or in state institutions. Instead, we found another way for them to contribute. You murdered children for their organs, Weatherbottom said flatly. We gave meaning to lives that would have been wasted, Gloomhaven countered. Do you know how many prominent citizens are alive today because of organs that came through our facility? A Supreme Court justice received a kidney in 1973. A Nobel Prize-winning scientist got a heart in 1981. The daughter of a president received bone marrow in 1988. These children, who had no future, became part of something greater. The casual way she discussed murdering children made Weatherbottom physically ill, but Wormwood pressed on, professionally detached. The coded ledgers. Category A through D. Walk us through the system. Category A was straightforward adoption. Healthy infants and toddlers. Clean backgrounds. No complications. They went to vetted families who could afford our premium services. How much? $50,000 in the early years. By the 1990s, upwards of $200,000 for the right child. Category B, special requirements. Older children, those with minor disabilities or behavioral issues. Also, children specifically selected for certain clients. Some people had very particular preferences. Specific ethnicities, physical features, temperaments. We would acquire children to match. Acquire? Through various means. Sometimes they were legitimately orphaned. Sometimes they were purchased from desperate parents. And sometimes, she paused, choosing her words carefully, they were obtained through our network of spotters. Kidnappers, Weatherbottom translated. Talent scouts, Gloomhaven corrected. They identified children who wouldn't be missed. Runaways, children from broken homes, immigrant families who couldn't go to authorities. We gave these children better lives than they would have had otherwise. Category C? Wormwood continued. Medical research. Some clients weren't looking for children to raise, but for specific genetic material. Rare blood types, unique genetic conditions, compatible DNA for experimental treatments. These children were maintained in our facility while participating in various studies. Human experimentation. Medical advancement. Every breakthrough requires pioneers. These children contributed to scientific progress that has saved thousands of lives. And Category D, we already know. Terminal procurement. Organ harvesting. Only when necessary, Gloomhaven insisted. Only when a child was beyond hope of placement and a critical need arose. We never wasted anything. The investigation expanded rapidly as federal agents processed the evidence seized from Blessed Angels. The facility's computers contained encrypted databases with thousands of entries dating back decades. Financial records revealed a complex web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and legitimate businesses used to launder money. More disturbing were the client lists. Wormwood's team identified over 2,000 families who had adopted through Blessed Angels. many of them prominent members of society. Judges, politicians, business leaders, celebrities, people with the means to bypass traditional adoption channels and the influence to avoid scrutiny. We're going to have to investigate every one of these adoptions, Wormwood told Weatherbottom. Some may be legitimate, or at least the adoptive parents may have believed they were. But others, they had to know something was wrong. You don't pay $200,000 for a baby without asking questions. The rescued children were placed in protective custody while authorities tried to determine their real identities. It was a heartbreaking process. Some had been in the facility so long they didn't remember their original names or families. Others had been told their parents were dead, sold them, or abandoned them. One girl, about 15, told investigators she'd been at Blessed Angels since she was 3. Her name, according to the facility's records, was Subject B, 47. She didn't know her real name, her birthday, or where she'd come from. All she knew was the routine of the facility, the daily medical checks, the preparation lessons for potential adoption, the constant fear of being moved to Category D. They told us Category D meant we were going to a special family, she said in a flat, emotionless voice. But the children who went to Category D never came back. We knew what it really meant. 3 days into the investigation, Zephaniah Crabapple made a connection that changed everything. He'd been analyzing the spotters network, trying to identify how children were targeted and acquired, when he noticed a pattern in the dates. "Sheriff, look at this," he said, spreading out a timeline on the conference table. "Major acquisitions, meaning kidnappings, always happened during specific events. County fairs, religious revivals, large public gatherings where crowds would make it easy for a child to disappear. So they were opportunistic. No, that's what I thought at first. But look closer. These events were sponsored by businesses connected to Blessed Angels' financial network. They weren't taking advantage of existing events. They were creating them. The implications were staggering. Blessed Angels hadn't just been trafficking children. They'd been orchestrating elaborate schemes to harvest them. The annual Millbrook County Fair, beloved by locals for 50 years, had been founded by a company that traced back to Gloomhaven's operation. The summer camp that served underprivileged youth, funded by the same network. The free medical clinics that served immigrant communities, data collection fronts to identify vulnerable children. They've been farming our community, Weatherbottom said, the full horror dawning on him. Every charity, every good deed, it was all designed to identify and acquire children. Agent Wormwood's team had been working on decrypting the most heavily protected files on the seized computers. What they found added another layer to the nightmare. The operation extended far beyond New England. There were connection points in 12 states, 3 Canadian provinces, and several Central American countries. Blessed Angels was just one node in a vast network that had been operating since the end of World War II. The files contained correspondence between Gloomhaven and other node operators, discussing transfers, comparing inventory, coordinating acquisitions. The language was corporate, clinical, discussing children as products with specific market values. One exchange from 1983 was particularly chilling. "We have surplus inventory in the 6 to 8 year range. Predominantly Caucasian, good health status. Market saturation in our region. Can you absorb? Can take up to 12 units. Preference for blue eyes, blonde hair. Premium pricing for those specifications. We'll select accordingly. Standard transfer protocol. Expect delivery within 2 weeks." Sheriff Weatherbottom had to leave the room after reading that. These were children they were discussing, not merchandise. The dehumanization was complete, systematic, and had been normalized over decades of operation. The investigation took an unexpected turn when one of the encrypted files revealed a list of what appeared to be code names: shepherd, gardener, collector, physician. Next to each code name were dates and dollar amounts, payments presumably to key figures in the network. Wormwood's team cross-referenced these payments with financial records and made a shocking discovery. Shepherd corresponded to payments made to a prominent Vermont senator who had served on the state's Child Welfare Committee for 20 years. Gardner was linked to the director of the largest orphanage in Massachusetts. Collector traced to a family court judge in New Hampshire. They had people everywhere, Wormwood explained to a horrified Weatherbottom. Inside the system, protecting the operation, feeding it. Every time someone got close to discovering the truth, these insiders would redirect the investigation or make evidence disappear. The physician designation led to perhaps the most disturbing discovery. Dr. Malachi Ironwood, chief of pediatrics at Boston Children's Hospital and a nationally respected figure in child welfare, had been receiving payments from the network for 30 years. His role, according to the documents, was to provide medical cover for the operation, falsifying death certificates, altering medical records, and most horrifically, performing the organ harvesting procedures. When federal agents arrived at his mansion in Brookline, they found he had committed suicide, leaving behind a confession that detailed his involvement. He described how it had started small, just helping to provide medical care for children in the adoption network. But gradually, he'd been drawn deeper. First, covering up irregularities, then actively participating in the trafficking, and finally performing transplant surgeries using organs from Category D children. I told myself I was saving lives, his confession read. The children who provided organs were beyond hope anyway, and the recipients were productive members of society. The utilitarian calculus seemed clear. One worthless life to save one valuable life. But there's no such thing as a worthless life. I became a monster by degrees, each compromise making the next easier. I deserve whatever judgment awaits me. The revelation that respected members of the medical community were involved sent shockwaves through the investigation. How many other doctors, nurses, and medical professionals had participated? How many hospitals had unknowingly received organs from murdered children? As the investigation widened, Weatherbottom found himself consumed by a terrible thought. His own daughter, Rebecca, had been adopted. He and his late wife, Margaret, had been unable to have children naturally, and in 1971 they'd adopted a beautiful baby girl through what they'd been told was a private adoption agency. The agency had been called Loving Hearts Family Services, and the adoption had cost them $5,000. A fortune at the time, but they'd been desperate for a child. With trembling hands, he pulled the adoption papers from his home safe and compared them to the documents seized from Blessed Angels. His worst fears were confirmed. Loving Hearts Family Services was listed as a subsidiary operation, a feeder network for Blessed Angels. Rebecca, now 25 and living in Boston with her own family, wasn't who they'd been told she was. According to the real records, she had been taken from a teenage mother in Ohio who had been told her baby died during delivery. The mother, Teresa Abernathy, was still alive, still living in Ohio, still mourning the daughter she'd never had a chance to raise. Weatherbottom sat in his home office, staring at a photo of Rebecca on her wedding day, wrestling with an impossible decision. Did he tell her the truth? Did he reach out to Teresa Abernathy? Did he confess his unknowing participation in child trafficking? He wasn't alone in this dilemma. Across New England, thousands of families were discovering that their adopted children might have been stolen. Support groups formed spontaneously as adoptive parents struggled with the revelation. Some immediately sought to find their children's birth families. Others chose to maintain silence, arguing that disrupting established families would only cause more trauma. The legal implications were staggering. Were the adoptions valid? Could birth parents reclaim children now grown with families of their own? What about inheritance rights, citizenship issues for internationally trafficked children, custody battles that might emerge? The revelation about Rebecca shattered Sheriff Weatherbottom's world. For 3 sleepless nights, he wrestled with the decision while continuing to lead the investigation. During the day, he interviewed witnesses and processed evidence. At night, he stared at old photo albums, seeing his daughter's childhood with, on the 4th day, he made his decision. He called Rebecca and asked her to come home, saying only that it was urgent and related to a case he was working on. She arrived that evening with her husband Daniel and their 2-year-old son, Timothy. "Dad, what's wrong?" Rebecca asked, immediately noticing his haggard appearance. "You look terrible." Weatherbottom had rehearsed this conversation 100 times, but faced with his daughter, the child he'd raised and loved for 25 years, words failed him. Finally, he handed her the adoption documents, both the falsified ones they'd always had and the real ones from Blessed Angel's records. Rebecca read them in silence, her face growing pale as she understood the implications. "I was stolen?" "We didn't know," Weatherbottom said, his voice breaking. "Your mother and I, we thought we were adopting an orphan. We were told your birth mother was a teenage runaway who died in childbirth. We never questioned it. We were just so happy to have you. My birth mother is alive?" "Teresa Abernathy. She lives in Cincinnati. She was told you died during delivery." Rebecca sat in stunned silence while her husband held her hand. Little Timothy played with blocks on the floor, oblivious to the family crisis unfolding around him. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Rebecca spoke again. "Do you have her contact information?" "I do, but Rebecca, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do. She spent 25 years mourning a daughter who wasn't dead. She deserves to know I'm alive. And I need to know where I came from." The meeting between Rebecca and Teresa Abernathy took place a week later in a neutral location, a hotel conference room in Albany. Weatherbottom accompanied his daughter, both for support and because Teresa had requested to meet the man who had raised her stolen child. Teresa was 43 now, with graying hair and eyes that carried decades of grief. She brought photo albums showing the family Rebecca had never known. Grandparents who had died thinking their granddaughter was gone, aunts and uncles, cousins. She also brought the small box of baby clothes she'd bought during her pregnancy, never used, kept all these years as the only physical connection to her lost daughter. "I was 17, Teresa explained, tears streaming down her face. "Unmarried, poor, scared. But I wanted you. I wanted to keep you so badly. When they told me you died, that there were complications, I wanted to die too. They wouldn't even let me see your body, said it would be too traumatic." Rebecca reached across the table and took her birth mother's hands. "I had a good life. My parents, the people who raised me, they loved me. They gave me everything a child could want. I know that doesn't undo what was done to you, but I need you to know I was loved. That's all I ever wanted for you," Teresa whispered. "To be loved, to be safe, to be happy." The reunion was bittersweet. 2 women connected by blood but separated by decades of lies, trying to bridge an unbridgeable gap. They would maintain contact, slowly building a relationship, but they would never be mother and daughter in the traditional sense. That opportunity had been stolen by blessed angels and could never be recovered. As stories like Rebecca's multiplied across New England, the investigation into the network expanded internationally. The Canadian authorities had raided connected facilities in Montreal and Toronto, finding similar operations. Mexican federales discovered a trafficking hub in Tijuana that had been sending children north for decades. Europol identified connections to orphanages in Romania, Ukraine, and Moldova. The true mastermind of the network remained elusive. Tabitha Gloomhaven, despite her central role in the American operation, was clearly middle management. References in the encrypted files pointed to someone called the Patriarch, who had apparently founded the network in the chaos following World War II. But the Patriarch's identity remained a mystery, hidden behind layers of code names and dead-end trails. Then came a breakthrough from an unexpected source. Cornelius Blackbone, a 91-year-old resident of the Millbrook County Nursing Home, contacted Sheriff Weatherbottom after seeing news coverage of the investigation. "I knew Tabitha Gloomhaven before she was Tabitha Gloomhaven," the old man said, his voice still clear despite his age. "During the war, I was stationed in Germany with the occupation forces. There was a woman there, worked with the displaced persons camps. She went by Sister Margaret, said she was a nun helping reunite families. But I saw her once without her habit. She had a distinctive birthmark on her neck, shaped like a crescent moon. Same mark Tabitha Gloomhaven has." "You're saying Gloomhaven was in Germany in 1945? Not just in Germany. She was working with a man, a former SS officer who had reinvented himself as a humanitarian. Klaus Richter, he called himself, though I doubt that was his real name. They were supposedly helping orphaned children find new homes in America. But there were rumors. What kind of rumors? That they were selling children, taking kids from displaced persons camps, telling families they'd died or been relocated, then shipping them to America for adoption. Made a fortune, from what I heard. After the war ended, they both disappeared. Then, in 1952, Tabitha Gloomhaven shows up in Vermont with money to start an adoption agency. This information sent the investigation in a new direction. If Gloomhaven had been involved in post-war trafficking, it explained the sophisticated nature of the operation and its international connections. It also suggested that the Patriarch might be Klaus Richter, or whatever his real name was. Federal investigators descended on the nursing home to interview Blackbone in detail. His memory, though foggy on some details, provided enough information to begin tracing the post-war trafficking network. Records from the International Tracing Service, set up after World War II to reunite families, showed discrepancies that matched Blackbone's account. Hundreds of children listed as dead or missing from DP camps had paperwork trails that ended abruptly, often with notations made by Sister Margaret. Meanwhile, the investigation at Blessed Angels continued to reveal new horrors. A sealed section of the basement, hidden behind what appeared to be a concrete wall, was discovered when ground-penetrating radar revealed hollow spaces beyond. When the wall was breached, investigators found something that exceeded even their worst expectations. It was a nursery, but not a normal one. 24 incubators lined the walls, most empty, but 6 containing infants. Medical equipment monitored their vital signs. Automated feeding systems provided nutrition, but there were no caregivers, no human contact. The babies lay alone in their plastic wombs, some crying weakly, others silent and staring. The records found in this section revealed its purpose: breeding. Blessed Angels hadn't just been trafficking existing children, they'd been creating them. Young women, usually runaways or immigrants, were brought to the facility, impregnated through artificial insemination, and kept until they gave birth. The babies were then raised in isolation until they were old enough to be placed in the regular adoption pipeline. One file contained photographs and medical records of someone identified only as Breeder 19. She had produced 8 children over 10 years before dying during her 9th pregnancy. Her children had been sold to families across the country, none aware their adopted babies were the product of what amounted to a human puppy mill. Agent Wormwood's team tracked down 3 women who had escaped from this breeding program. Their testimonies were harrowing. They described being held prisoner, forcibly impregnated, and having their babies taken immediately after birth. They were told if they ever spoke about their experiences, they would be killed, and most believed it. Only the complete dismantling of blessed angels gave them the courage to come forward. Martha Grimsby, now 38 and living under an assumed name in Maine, testified about her 5 years in the facility. "They took me when I was 15, she said, speaking barely above a whisper. "I was a runaway, living on the streets in Boston. A woman offered me a job, said I could work in a nursery, taking care of babies. I love children, always have, so I said yes. But there was no job, they locked me in a room, and they made me have babies. 5 babies in 5 years. I never got to hold them, never got to name them. They were just taken away. How did you escape? I didn't. They let me go and I couldn't have any more children. The last pregnancy damaged something inside me. When the doctor said I was sterile, they drove me to a bus station, gave me $1,000 and told me to disappear. Said if I ever told anyone, they'd find me and kill me. I believed them. I still believe them." The breeding program added another layer of criminality to the charges. Not just trafficking and murder, but systematic rape, false imprisonment, and forced pregnancy. The number of victims continued to grow as more women came forward, emboldened by Martha's testimony. Sheriff Weatherbottom found himself at the center of the largest criminal investigation in Vermont's history. His small county sheriff's department had been transformed into a multi-agency task force with representatives from the FBI, CIA, Interpol, and various state agencies. He'd gone from investigating petty theft and domestic disputes to unraveling an international child trafficking network with roots in Nazi Germany. The pressure was taking its toll. He'd lost 20 pounds in the month since the investigation began. His hands shook constantly from too much coffee and too little sleep. His relationship with Rebecca had become strained as she struggled to process her own trauma, while he continued to lead the investigation that had revealed it. Then came the night that nearly broke him. He was reviewing financial records at his office, trying to trace money transfers between Blessed Angels and its international partners, when his deputy rushed in. "Sheriff, we've got a situation at the old Blessed Angels building. Someone's inside." The building had been sealed as a crime scene, with 24-hour security. But the guards had reported seeing lights moving through the upper floors, areas that had been cleared and should have been empty. Weatherbottom arrived to find the building surrounded by federal agents and local police. The security guards reported that at least 3 people had entered through a concealed entrance they hadn't known existed, a tunnel that connected to the storm sewer system. "They're destroying evidence," Agent Wormwood said. "We must have missed something important, and they've come back for it." The tactical team entered the building, with Weatherbottom following despite Wormwood's protests. They moved through the familiar halls, now stripped of their facade of normalcy, revealing the industrial horror beneath. The sounds of destruction echoed from above. Crashes, breaking glass, the hiss of accelerants. They found them on the 3rd floor, in what had been Tabitha Gloomhaven's private office. 3 figures in black, faces covered, were feeding documents into barrels of burning chemicals. The smoke was toxic, forcing the tactical team to retreat and call for hazmat units. By the time the fire was suppressed and the smoke cleared, the three intruders had vanished, presumably through the same tunnel system they'd used to enter. But they'd left something behind. In their haste to destroy documents, one folder had fallen behind a filing cabinet. The folder contained something investigators had been searching for since the beginning: the real identity of the patriarch. His name was Ernst Kaufmann, and he had indeed been an SS officer, specifically involved in the Lebensborn program, the Nazi breeding program designed to create racially pure children. After the war, he'd escaped through the rat lines to South America, but instead of hiding, he'd built on his experience. He'd created a network that spanned continents, trafficking children to wealthy families who shared his vision of genetic superiority. The documents in the folder included correspondence between Kaufmann and Gloomhaven dating back to 1946. They revealed the true ideology behind the network. It wasn't just about money, it was about eugenics. They were selectively breeding and distributing children based on genetic characteristics, attempting to influence the demographics of entire regions by controlling who raised the next generation. "We are gardeners of humanity," Kaufmann had written in one letter. "By placing superior genetic stock with influential families and removing inferior stock from the breeding pool, we shape the future of the species. The Reich fell, but the mission continues through quieter means." The revelation that Blessed Angels was connected to Nazi ideology sent shockwaves through the investigation. Every adoption now had to be reviewed not just for trafficking, but for potential eugenic selection. Had certain children been targeted for elimination while others were preferentially placed based on their genetic characteristics? The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit created a profile of the network's selection criteria based on the seized records. The pattern was chilling. Children with physical or mental disabilities were invariably marked for Category D, organ harvesting. Children from certain ethnic backgrounds were either eliminated or sold to families in other countries, effectively removing them from the American gene pool. Meanwhile, children who met specific physical and intellectual criteria were placed with wealthy, influential families, ensuring they would have advantages in life and be more likely to reproduce successfully. It was a long-term genetic engineering project disguised as an adoption agency, and it had been operating for over 70 years. The hunt for Ernst Kaufmann consumed the next 3 months of Sheriff Weatherbottom's life. The 94-year-old former SS officer, if still alive, had managed to evade justice for over 50 years while running one of the most extensive child trafficking networks in history. Intelligence agencies across the world joined the search, following paper trails through Switzerland, Argentina, Paraguay, and South Africa. Meanwhile, the full scope of the Blessed Angels operation continued to unfold. The final count was staggering. Over the course of 44 years, the network had trafficked approximately 8,000 children across North America alone. Of these, records indicated that at least 600 had been terminated for organ harvesting. Another 1,000 had been subjected to medical experimentation. The breeding program had produced over 300 babies, scattered to families across the continent. The legal aftermath was equally complex. Thousands of adoptive families were thrown into crisis as they grappled with the possibility that their children had been stolen. DNA databases were established to match trafficked children with birth families, but many resisted testing, afraid of what they might discover. Support groups formed in every major city, bringing together adoptive parents, adoptees, and birth families trying to navigate the emotional minefield. Sheriff Weatherbottom attended one such meeting in Burlington, hoping to better understand what the victims were experiencing. The stories he heard there would haunt him forever. "I adopted my son Marcus in 1978, said Eleanor Thistledown, a retired teacher. paid $30,000 to Blessed Angels, which was our entire savings. They told us his mother was a drug addict who'd died of an overdose. Last month, we found out she was actually a college student from Guatemala, whose baby was stolen from a hospital nursery. She's been searching for him for 43 years. Marcus is 45 now, with his own family. How do I tell him his entire life story is a lie? My daughter Sarah was supposedly orphaned in a car accident, added Josiah Millstone. We've raised her for 12 years. She's our whole world. Now, we find out she was kidnapped from a playground in Montreal. Her real parents thought she was dead. They had a funeral for her. How is any of this supposed to be resolved? There were no easy answers. Some families chose to maintain contact with both adoptive and biological relatives, creating extended networks of shared custody and visitation. Others cut ties completely, unable to handle the emotional complexity. Several high-profile custody battles erupted when biological parents attempted to reclaim children who had been raised by other families for decades. The investigation took a dramatic turn in February 1997, when a package arrived at the FBI field office in Burlington, addressed to Agent Bathsheba Wormwood. Inside was a cassette tape and a handwritten note. The patriarch wishes to make a statement. The voice on the tape was elderly but clear, speaking accented English with the precise diction of someone educated in pre-war Europe. My name is Ernst Kaufmann. I am 94 years old and I am dying. Pancreatic cancer, the doctors say, 3 months at most. I could die in silence, take my secrets to the grave, but I find myself wanting the world to understand what we achieved. You call it trafficking, kidnapping, murder. I call it evolution management. For 70 years, I have shaped the genetic future of North America. Every child we placed was selected for specific traits: intelligence, physical health, genetic potential. Every child we removed from the breeding pool was inferior stock that would have weakened the species. Consider the results. How many leaders in business, politics, science, and arts were our children? Senator James Crawford of Connecticut, one of ours. Dr. Monica Stern, who developed the cure for Hartley's disease, one of ours. The CEO of Practical Electronics, the federal judge who sits on the Third Circuit, the actress who won 3 Academy Awards, all ours. We didn't just place children randomly. We placed superior genetic stock with families positioned to maximize their potential. We created a shadow aristocracy, a genetic upper class that has been unconsciously shaping society for decades. You may arrest Tabitha and the others. You may dismantle our network, but you cannot undo what we've done. Thousands of our children are now adults in positions of power and influence, passing their superior genes to the next generation. We have won, even in defeat. The tape continued for another hour, detailing the network's operations, naming collaborators, and revealing the locations of additional facilities. But it was the ideological content that proved most disturbing. Kaufman genuinely believed he had been conducting a noble experiment in human evolution, saving humanity from genetic degradation. The tape provided enough information to locate Kaufman. He was living in a fortified compound in the mountains of Chile, protected by private security, and apparently by Chilean intelligence officials he'd been bribing for decades. The Chilean government initially refused extradition requests, citing Kaufman's age and poor health, but international pressure eventually forced their hand. The raid on Kaufman's compound was conducted by Chilean special forces with FBI observers present. Sheriff Weatherbottom had requested to be part of the observation team, a request granted due to his central role in uncovering the network. The compound was a modernist fortress built into the mountainside, accessible only by a single winding road or helicopter. As the special forces moved in, Weatherbottom watched through binoculars from a position on the opposite ridge. The assault was swift and professional, but when they breached the main building, they found it empty except for staff. Kaufman had vanished. A search of the compound revealed an extensive underground complex, larger even than the one beneath Blessed Angels. It contained living quarters, medical facilities, and most disturbingly, a fully equipped nursery with 12 infants. These babies, DNA testing would later confirm, were the products of Kaufman's continued breeding program, using genetic material stolen from what he considered superior specimens. In Kaufman's personal study, investigators found thousands of files detailing genetic profiles, breeding recommendations, and placement strategies dating back to 1946. The scope of his eugenics project was breathtaking. He had been attempting to create what he called evolutionary pressure points, concentrations of superior genetics in positions of social influence that would gradually transform the human species. One file, marked Project Tomorrow, outlined a 100-year plan for genetic manipulation of the American population. By selectively breeding and placing children, Kaufman believed he could increase the average IQ by 20 points, eliminate genetic diseases, and create a master class that would naturally rise to leadership positions. The science was a mixture of genuine genetic knowledge and pseudoscientific racism. Kaufman had been operating on theories developed by Nazi scientists in the 1930s, updated with modern genetic understanding, but still fundamentally flawed in their assumptions about racial superiority and genetic determinism. 3 weeks after the raid, Kaufman's body was found in a hidden bunker deep in the Andes. He had committed suicide using cyanide, the classic Nazi escape route. Beside his body was a final message: "I die unrepentant. History will vindicate my work when the genetic superiority of our children becomes undeniable. I have planted seeds that will bloom for generations." The Fourth Reich was not political, it was biological, and it has already won. With Kaufman dead and the Chilean compound dismantled, the investigation shifted focus to damage control and victim support. The FBI established a task force specifically to trace all children trafficked through the network, a project estimated to take decades. DNA databases were expanded internationally, allowing families separated by the trafficking to potentially reconnect. Sheriff Weatherbottom found himself at the center of a media storm. The small-town sheriff who had uncovered an international trafficking ring became a reluctant celebrity. Book deals, movie rights, speaking engagements, the offers poured in. He refused them all, focusing instead on helping the victims in his own community. Millbrook County established the first comprehensive support center for trafficking victims and their families. It offered counseling, legal assistance, and mediation services for families navigating the complex aftermath of the revelations. Weatherbottom spent most of his time there, working directly with affected families. One case particularly touched him. 8-year-old Timothy Blackwood had been adopted through Blessed Angels just 2 years before the raid. His adoptive parents, Marcus and Jennifer Blackwood, loved him deeply, but the investigation revealed he had been kidnapped from a family in Mexico. His birth parents, Maria and Carlos Mendoza, had been searching for him desperately. The two families met at the support center, with Weatherbottom mediating. The pain in the room was palpable. Two sets of parents who loved the same child, torn between justice and trauma. Timothy, confused and frightened, clung to the only parents he remembered while the Mendozas wept for the son they'd lost. After hours of discussion, they reached an unprecedented agreement. Timothy would continue living with the Blackwoods but spend summers with the Mendozas. Both families would be recognized as his parents. It wasn't perfect, but it was a solution that prioritized the child's well-being over adult claims to ownership. This became known as the Millbrook model and was adopted by courts across the country as a template for resolving similar cases. It acknowledged that while the trafficking was criminal, the bonds formed between adoptive families were real, and breaking them would only create more trauma. Tabitha Gloomhaven's trial began in September 1997. She had been charged with 623 counts of murder, over 3,000 counts of kidnapping, and numerous charges related to human trafficking, organ harvesting, and crimes against humanity. It was the most extensive criminal indictment in American legal history. The trial lasted 8 months. Prosecutors presented thousands of documents, hundreds of witnesses, and evidence that filled an entire warehouse. The defense's strategy was to claim diminished capacity, arguing that Gloomhaven had been brainwashed by Kaufman and was herself a victim of Nazi indoctrination. Gloomhaven took the stand in her own defense, maintaining her eerily calm demeanor throughout days of testimony. "I believed we were doing good," she said, her voice steady. "Ernst convinced me that we were improving humanity, that the children we placed would grow up to be leaders and innovators, the ones we terminated. He said they were mercy killings, preventing lives of suffering and degeneracy." "You killed 600 children," the prosecutor stated flatly. "I facilitated the transfer of genetic material from non-viable specimens to productive members of society," she replied, still using the clinical language of the network. "Every organ we harvested saved a life worth living." Worth living according to whom? According to objective measures of human value: intelligence, health, genetic potential, social contribution. You're describing Nazi eugenics. I'm describing rational selection. Nature does it through evolution. We simply accelerated the process. Her testimony revealed the depth of her indoctrination. Even facing life in prison, she couldn't break free from the ideology Kaufman had instilled in her. She spoke of the murdered children as necessary sacrifices, the trafficking as distribution of resources, the breeding program as quality control. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. Gloomhaven was sentenced to 623 consecutive life sentences, ensuring she would die in prison. As she was led away, she turned to the gallery where many of her victims' families sat. "In 50 years, when the children we placed have transformed society, you'll understand," she said. "We were gardeners, not monsters." The investigation continued to ripple outward. Dozens of doctors, lawyers, social workers, and government officials were arrested for their roles in facilitating the network. Some had been willing collaborators. Others had been blackmailed or bribed into cooperation. The trials would continue for years. Dr. Bartholomew Ashford, who had performed many of the organ harvesting procedures, was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. Later commuted to life imprisonment. Judge Theodore Blackstone, who had rubber-stamped fraudulent adoption papers for 20 years, received 40 years in prison. Social worker Prudence Nightingale, who had identified vulnerable children for the network to target, got 30 years. But for every person convicted, investigators suspected 10 more had escaped justice. The network had been too vast, operated for too long, had too many connections in high places. Files had been destroyed, witnesses had disappeared, and some collaborators were simply too powerful to prosecute. The most controversial aspect of the aftermath was what to do about Kaufman's children, the thousands of adults who had been selectively placed according to his eugenic theories. Many had indeed achieved remarkable success, just as Kaufman had predicted. But was this due to superior genetics, or simply because they'd been placed with wealthy, educated families who provided advantages? Dr. Patricia Worthington, a geneticist at Harvard, and, it was discovered, one of Kaufman's children herself, conducted a study comparing the genetic profiles of network children with their achievements. Her findings, published in the Journal of Human Genetics, were shocking. "There is no evidence of genetic superiority among the trafficked children," she wrote. "Their success rates correlate entirely with socioeconomic advantages, not genetic factors." Kaufman's eugenic theories were scientifically baseless. He destroyed thousands of lives for a racist fantasy. The study was controversial, with some arguing that Worthington was biased, trying to distance herself from her origins. Others pointed out that many of Kaufman's children had struggled with mental health issues, addiction, and suicide, hardly markers of genetic superiority. Sheriff Weatherbottom retired in 1998, exhausted by the investigation and its aftermath. At his retirement ceremony, attended by hundreds of law enforcement officials from around the world, he gave a speech that would be remembered as one of the most powerful statements on the case. "We uncovered a great evil, but in doing so we also revealed a great failure, our failure as a society, to protect the most vulnerable among us." This network operated for 70 years, not because they were brilliant, but because we weren't watching. We trusted too easily, questioned too little, and ignored signs that should have alarmed us. Every child who was trafficked, murdered, or experimented upon was failed by systems that should have protected them. Law enforcement, social services, medical professionals, government officials, we all share responsibility for allowing this to continue for so long. The victims of this network deserve more than justice. They deserve a promise that we will never again turn away from children in danger, that we will question unusual adoptions, investigate missing children thoroughly, and create systems that can't be corrupted by money or influence. But most importantly, we must reject absolutely the ideology that made this possible, the belief that some lives are worth more than others. Every child who died in that facility was precious. Every child who was trafficked had inherent value. There are no superior genes, no master race, no biological elite. There are only human beings, all deserving of dignity, protection, and love. The speech received a standing ovation, but Weatherbottom took no satisfaction from it. He knew that somewhere, in some other country or state, another network was probably operating. The demand for children, for adoption, for organs, for worse purposes, hadn't disappeared with Blessed Angel's destruction. In his retirement, Weatherbottom worked with Rebecca to establish the Stolen Children Foundation, dedicated to reuniting trafficked children with their birth families and supporting all parties through the process. Rebecca had become a powerful advocate, using her own story to push for legislative changes and better oversight of adoption agencies. The relationship between Rebecca and her birth mother, Teresa, had evolved into something beautiful and complex. They weren't mother and daughter in the traditional sense, but they had built a bond based on shared loss and mutual respect. Teresa became a grandmother to Timothy, who called her Grandma T and spent summers with her in Ohio. The investigation's final report, released in 2000, ran to over 10,000 pages. It documented the complete structure of the network, naming 341 active collaborators and over 1,000 people who had knowingly benefited from its services. It traced financial transactions totaling over $2 billion across 5 decades. It listed every known victim, every falsified document, every crime committed in the name of genetic improvement. But perhaps the most important part of the report was its recommendations for preventing future trafficking networks. Mandatory DNA testing for all adoptions, international databases for missing children, regular audits of adoption agencies, and severe penalties for officials who facilitate trafficking. Many of these recommendations were adopted into law, creating what became known as the Weatherbottom Protocols. Tabitha Gloomhaven died in prison in 2003, unrepentant to the end. Her final words, according to the nurse who attended her, were, "The work continues." This cryptic statement sparked new investigations, but no active networks connected to the original operation were discovered. The last official action of the Blessed Angels investigation came in 2005, when the site of the agency was excavated completely. Ground-penetrating radar had revealed additional underground chambers that hadn't been discovered in the initial raid. These chambers contained the remains of children from the earliest years of the operation, before the organ harvesting program had been established. They had simply been murdered and buried when they were no longer useful. 137 additional victims were recovered and given proper burials. A memorial was erected on the site, listing every known victim of the network. The inscription read, "In memory of the stolen children. May such evil never again take root in our communities." Sheriff Jedediah Weatherbottom died in 2010 at the age of 77. His funeral was attended by thousands, including many of the families he'd helped reunite. Rebecca gave the eulogy, describing a man haunted by the evil he'd uncovered but determined to bring light to the darkness. "My father discovered the worst of humanity in that basement," she said. "But he also discovered the best, the resilience of survivors, the love that transcends biological bonds, the determination to protect the innocent. He often said that the Blessed Angels case had stolen his faith in institutions, but restored his faith in individuals. Every person who chose to speak out, to testify, to face their trauma in order to prevent others' suffering, they were the real angels." The Blessed Angels Adoption Agency case remains the largest child trafficking investigation in history. Its repercussions continue to be felt decades later, as DNA technology improves and more connections are discovered. Occasionally, an elderly person will take a DNA test for genealogical purposes and discover they were one of Kaufman's children, their entire life history suddenly uncertain. Support groups still meet in community centers across the country. Aging adoptive parents, middle-aged adoptees, and elderly birth parents gather to share their stories and support each other through the ongoing trauma. The facilitators always begin the meetings the same way. "We are here because of a great evil that was done. But we are also here because that evil was exposed, confronted, and defeated. We are survivors, all of us. Those who were taken, those who lost, and those who unknowingly participated. Together, we reclaim our stories from those who tried to steal them." The last known survivor of the breeding program, Martha Grimsby, now runs a foundation supporting victims of human trafficking. She has never been able to locate the 5 children taken from her, despite extensive searching. But she continues to hope that one day, one of them will take a DNA test and find her. "They stole my babies," she says, in her presentations to law enforcement agencies. "They stole my body, my youth, my innocence. But they didn't steal my humanity. That's the one thing Ernst Kaufman never understood. You can't breed humanity in or out of people. It's inherent in all of us, even in the darkest places." The compound in Chile where Kaufman died has been converted into a memorial and research center dedicated to preventing human trafficking. The nursery where his final breeding experiments took place now houses a school for local children. The transformation from a site of eugenic horror to one of education and growth is seen as a symbol of humanity's ability to overcome even its darkest impulses. But questions remain. How many other networks operated parallel to Blessed Angels? How many children were trafficked through routes that were never discovered? How many people walking around today have no idea their entire life story is built on a lie? These questions have no answers. The full truth of the Blessed Angels Network died with Ernst Kaufman and Tabitha Gloomhaven. But the lessons learned from its exposure have saved countless children from similar fates. Every adoption that undergoes proper scrutiny, every missing child report that receives full investigation, every vulnerable family that receives support rather than exploitation. These are the true memorial to the victims. In Millbrook County, the Victorian mansion that housed Blessed Angels still stands, converted now into the Weatherbottom Center for Child Protection. Social workers, law enforcement, and medical professionals train there, learning to recognize the signs of trafficking and exploitation. In the basement, where children once waited in cells, there is now a museum documenting the case, ensuring that future generations never forget what happened. The center's director, Timothy Blackwood, the boy whose case led to the Millbrook model, now 43 years old, often gives tours to training groups. He stands in what was once the holding area and tells his story of being loved by two families, of growing up knowing he was stolen but also cherished, of finding peace in a situation that had no perfect resolution. Evil thrives in darkness and silence, he tells the groups. The moment Sheriff Weatherbottom and investigator Crabapple entered this basement with flashlights and cameras, the evil began to die. Your job is to be those flashlights, to illuminate the dark corners where predators think they can operate unseen. Every child you protect honors the memory of those who weren't protected in time. The tour always ends in the Memorial Garden, where 760 small stones bear the names of confirmed victims. But there's also a larger stone, inscribed with a single word: unknown. It represents all the children whose names were lost, whose stories were erased, whose fates remain mysteries. Visitors often leave flowers, toys, or notes at this stone. One note, yellowed with age and laminated for preservation, has been there since the memorial's dedication. It reads, "To my child, taken before I could name you. I never held you, never saw your face, never heard you cry. But I have loved you every day for 30 years. Somewhere, I pray you are alive, happy, loved, and if we never meet, know that you were wanted, mourned, and remembered. A mother who never forgot." The note's author has never been identified, but it stands as a testament to all the connections severed by the network. Bonds that even the most elaborate trafficking operation couldn't entirely break. As the years pass and the last direct witnesses to the Blessed Angels horror age and die, the case passes from living memory into history, but its lessons remain relevant. Human trafficking continues worldwide. Adoption fraud still occurs, and vulnerable children still disappear into darkness. The difference now is awareness. The Blessed Angels case stripped away the comforting illusion that such evil only happens in other places, to other people. It showed that monsters can wear grandmotherly smiles, that institutions can be thoroughly corrupted, and that silence and willful blindness are evil's greatest allies. Every year, on November 17th, the anniversary of the raid, child protection advocates around the world observe Light in the Darkness Day. Candles are lit for trafficking victims, awareness campaigns are launched, and communities recommit to protecting their most vulnerable members. Sheriff Jedediah Weatherbottom's photograph hangs in the National Law Enforcement Memorial in Washington, D.C., alongside a plaque that reads, "He entered the darkness so children could return to the light." But perhaps his true legacy is simpler, found in the words he spoke to Rebecca when she asked him how he found the courage to pursue the investigation despite its horrors. When you know children are suffering, you don't need courage. You just need to remember that someone has to stand between them and the darkness. On that day, in that place, it was my turn to stand. The Blessed Angels Adoption Agency case officially closed in 2006, though related investigations continue to this day. The network Ernst Kaufman and Tabitha Gloomhaven built over 70 years was destroyed, but the vigilance it inspired continues. Every suspicious adoption investigated, every missing child found, every vulnerable family protected is a small victory against the darkness they represented. And in the basement of a converted Victorian mansion in Millbrook County, Vermont, the cells that once held stolen children now hold their memory. A permanent reminder that evil can flourish anywhere, but so can the courage to confront it. The final entry in Sheriff Weatherbottom's personal journal, found after his death, perhaps best summarizes the case's impact. I spent my career believing I was protecting a good community from external threats. The Blessed Angels case showed me the threat was internal, woven into our institutions, hidden behind respectability and trust. We were all complicit through our blindness. But if there's hope, it's this. When finally forced to see the evil among us, most people chose to fight it. The community that had been deceived for decades rallied to support the victims. Families that had unknowingly benefited from trafficking opened their homes and hearts to healing. Evil is real and more sophisticated than most people imagine. But so is good. And when good people finally open their eyes, evil's days are numbered. I pray the children we couldn't save forgive us our blindness. And I pray the children we did save remember that someone eventually came for them. That someone eventually cared enough to look into the darkness. That's all any of us can do. Be willing to look, willing to see, willing to act. The children are counting on us.